Good morning, everybody. Can I ask you to sit down and take your seats? Which is what most people do when they sit down. Good. I'm very keen to start because, as you all know, we've got a very packed program and we can't afford to get behind. My name is Karen Newman. I'm from the Liberal Jewish Synagogue in London, and I'm also glorying right now in being the Deputy Chair of Liberal Judaism. Thank you. It's my huge and great pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker this morning, Michael Uygur. Michael is, as you all know, the Chief Executive of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. It's not easy. I've never felt a pinch point more crucial of 4 Jews, 5 opinions than on the floor of a board meeting. Michael, his bio is in the book. There are very few communal jobs Michael hasn't done or been very, very close to. He came to us from UJIA, and he has been an amazing, steadying influence on the board as we've moved in these choppy waters of recent years. Some liberal communities aren't sure exactly what the board does, so I'm really glad that Michael's here to clarify that. We all get off the bus at a different place. Me, I get off the bus at around the point of the kosher washing up liquid, but for me, that's not the point. I want to live in a country where for people for whom kosher washing up liquid is important, they can have it. And the people who fight that fight every fight, we don't have to do it because it's the board that fights that fight every fight. Michael, the floor is yours. You are most welcome here.
Hi, thanks, Karen. It sounds on, doesn't it?
Yeah, good.
I'm only using the mic because I understand this is going to be recorded or streamed. I'm very uncomfortable holding a mic. I much prefer to speak with both my hands because I don't really know any other way of speaking. I just saw somebody from Southgate Progressive. I don't know who it was. Yes, hello. So I grew up in Palmer's Green, and in fact, the Progressive Synagogue in Southgate is the first Progressive Synagogue I ever went to. And I remember it very warmly, actually. I went to what was then called a confirmation ceremony for a friend of mine who I was in youth movement with, and it was a very interesting experience. Growing up in an Orthodox community, it was pretty, and I lived an Orthodox life for quite a large number of years. So it was quite strange going there for the first time. But it began a journey where I've been a member of every single denomination in many different countries, and I'm really one of those Jews who like synagogues without worrying too much which denomination they are. It's really an honour to be here. I've loved working with liberal and progressive synagogues over the last few years. I've spoken at a couple of events online, and it's really nice to finally be at one in person. And I want to speak a little bit about the board, but I think that really needs to speak in context, because the board exists in the context of what's happening within British Jewry. Now, some of you will know, some of you won't know, that the board goes back to 1760. So, we're quite an old organisation. As I was mentioning to someone earlier, it's the second oldest organisation I've been involved with because I went to JFS, which was founded 30 years before the Board of Deputies. So I like working or being attached to old organisations, old institutions, and renewing them, making them relevant, making them part of the contemporary dynamic of our community is really what I've enjoyed doing for much of my career. So in thinking about the role of the board today, I want to focus a little bit, just for a couple of minutes, on the idea of Jewish politics. And if we think about the trajectory that Jewish politics has been on, I suspect there are some quite interesting parallels with liberal and progressive Jewry as well. So the origin of the board in 1760 goes back to the coronation of King George III, when the Bevis Marks Spanish and Portuguese synagogue chose a delegation to go and bless the king and pledge loyalty to him. And they chose representatives, deputados, and that's from the Portuguese. That's the origin of the word. And if one thinks about the role of Jewish politics in those early years, it was to pledge loyalty, to pledge allegiance. Yes, we may have come from Holland, Germany, France, Poland, other parts of the world, but once we are here, we are now loyal English subjects, British subjects. We're proud to be subjects to the king. And that categorizes, that defines the early, well, more than decades, centuries, really up until, I would argue, up until the early 20th century, that defines British Jewish politics, much of religious politics, and certainly to the Anglo-Jewish life. We want to be loyal to the king, loyal to the crown, loyal to the government. And so early Jewish politics was about affirming that loyalty. And if you think how far that goes, when in 1917 the British government issues the Balfour Declaration, the Board of Deputies is ambivalent, if not hostile to it. The very idea that we would say that Jews have a loyalty to another place or another people outside of these islands was very threatening. It was very scary to the British Jewish leadership. And you can see just before the Balfour Declaration was issued, a couple of months earlier in the Times, what was called the Conjoint Committee of the Board of Deputies writes a letter rejecting the idea of the Balfour Declaration. So early Jewish politics was about the Jewish community demonstrating, proving that we are loyal subjects and have no other loyalty. In the 1920s, Anglo-Jewish politics undergoes a radical shift when the traditional leadership of the German-speaking Jews and the Sephardi-speaking Jews, actually the other way around, the Sephardi Jews and the German-speaking Jews are really overwhelmed numerically by Jews who had come here from the Pale of Settlement, probably like many of your grandparents, mine as well. And this new Ashkenazi, more working-class proletariat-type leadership is actually very comfortable both with their Jewish identity and with what's going on in Palestine. And using Zionism, they really take over much of British Jewry. I won't say everything. There are pockets that remain ambivalent towards Zionism right through until the Holocaust and then the establishment of the State of Israel. But one can see a real shift. And so the next wave of Jewish politics becomes about Jews fighting for Jewish rights wherever they might be. And that becomes a really important part of the Board of Deputies mantra as well. And by the way, there are parallels to this happening in Jewish communities across the world. So rather than being obsessed with proving our loyalty to our government, we recognize, and I think the events of the 20th century are going to justify that shift. Now it becomes about fighting for Jewish rights wherever they might be. But that's not the end of it. As one moves on through the 20th century, there are additions now. So we're going to replace that model. That model will remain true until this day. But we'll see that Jewish politics will shift. And as Jews become more confident, both in their own communities and in the work they're doing for Jews around the world, you'll then start seeing Jews as Jews fighting for the rights of other causes, of other issues. And what's sometimes called the new Jewish politics is Jews organizing on behalf of, it might be gender issues, racial issues, disability issues, whatever it might be. Or it might be fighting for persecuted communities around the world, wherever they might be. And so latter Jewish politics is really about there being a Jewish voice to fight for global causes, whatever they might be. Often it's framed as tikkun olam. I'm sure many of you know often that expression, repairing the world. Sometimes it's called social justice, and different communities use different words. But one can see this progression in Jewish politics over the last couple of hundred years, fighting for ourselves in this country, fighting for Jewish rights anywhere, and then fighting for global causes as Jews. Where I get worried about this is when Jews start to think, well, I will fight for those global causes, but I don't need my Jewish identity in order to do it. And that's when, of course, one starts to see Jews leaving the Jewish community. And by the way, that affects Jews in every country of the world, in every denomination. That's just an issue, I think, of early or coming towards mid, but early 21st century life. That change is happening. The Board of Deputies reflects all of those trends, and we can see absolutely all of them. And I consider it an absolute privilege to be at the professional head of this organisation, working alongside a fantastic set of honorary officers and an executive and deputies generally. And so I want to spend just a few minutes looking at, well, particularly actually all three of those trends and how the board has got involved with it. So first of all, that first one, our status as Jews in this country. It is extraordinary to me that in the 21st century, British Jews had to fight for our status as Jews in this country. But that was the toxic legacy that we were left under the Jeremy Corbyn leadership. And I'm very proud that the board, together with the JLC and the Jewish Labour Movement and other communal organisations, stood up as a community to Jeremy Corbyn and said, your version of the Labour Party will not be acceptable to us. And it is to the credit of the Labour people who saw Corbyn out and the Labour leadership that has replaced Corbyn that we are now in a situation where Jews can vote for any political party of their choice in this country. You want to vote Conservative? Fantastic. You want to vote Lib Dem? Fantastic. You want to vote Labour? Fantastic. You want to vote Green? Wonderful. Any party you want to vote for, I think we're now in a position where Jews can once again vote based on their values rather than what a leadership might do to the Jewish community. And this campaign, which the board was very involved with, both under, well, particularly under Johnny Arkush's leadership and then by Marie van der Zyl, our current president, I think was tremendously brave. It was very, very unusual for the Jewish community leadership in our era to take a stand against a major political party. But it was just right that they did it. And we as a community, all of us, can be very proud that when the push came to the shove, our community leadership stood up and was prepared to say, as you'll remember, enough is enough. I am aware there are Jews out there in the British Jewish community who backed Corbyn and backed Corbyn's vision of Labour, were aware of them. They were a minority. I personally, and we as an organisation, thought they were wrong. But you know, I have to acknowledge that there may be some in this room, and I respect that, I acknowledge that. But I don't regret for a second the decision that the board and other Jewish organisations took in saying no. The second paradigm, or second model I presented, was the idea of British Jews fighting for the rights of Jews around the world. And that shift that took place, particularly in the 1920s and then on with the rise of Nazism and the establishment of Israel, the board, of course, did become a Zionist organization. Your own movement went through a similar journey in different ways, of course, and your youth movement proudly affiliated to Netzer some decades ago. And that also was a really important move, where British Jews said, actually, we recognize that there are some causes outside of Britain that on behalf of the Jewish community, we must be involved. And I would say probably 3 or 4 of the most important ones are the establishment of the State of Israel, the fight for Soviet Jewry and other diaspora juries, and I had a third one. It's just slipped my mind, and it will come back to me. Oh, no, that's in the third paradigm. So I will certainly come to that. Oh, of course I remember it. Holocaust Memorial, right? Memorializing the Holocaust, and of course, what's Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day in the Jewish calendar, just a week after the end of Pesach, is of course also part of the board's heritage. And there are other examples as well. But the board does take a very central role in fighting for Jewish rights throughout the world. We're part of the World Jewish Congress. We spend a lot of time traveling around the world and supporting Jewish communities when they request assistance. One of the things the board will not do is intervene in a country on behalf of its Jewish community if that Jewish community does not want us there. And that's really, really... And by the way, they do that to us as well. They would not come and fight here against Corbyn, for example, without being in complete coordination with us. And that global international Jewish collegiality is really, really important. And a lot of the board's time today is spent dealing with Israel. In fact, there is no issue, and Carol and others in the room who are deputies can attest to that, there is no issue that divides the board and unites the board more than Israel. So there is huge passion for Israel at the Board of Deputies, and yet the voices that one hears around Israel are incredibly diverse. We have from Yachad on one side to supporters of Stand With Us or JNF, which identify themselves as more centrist, to more pro-Mizrahi Likud on the other side. And we get more questions to the president on this issue than any other topic whatsoever. So people might think that British Jewry is losing interest in Israel. There are other things more important. Right now, looking at the Board of Deputies, I'm not seeing that the case. I'm still seeing huge interest. And in fact, it's not so surprising. Israel's population, well, maybe some of you aren't even aware of this, Israel's population in the next couple of years is going to top 10 million. It's extraordinary. In my mental landscape, there are 3 million Jews in Israel, because that's how I grew up. I can see some heads nodding, right? It's going to hit 10 million this decade, if not in a couple of years' time. Israel is no longer a small country. It's a mid-sized European country, incomparable. It's really quite remarkable. And so, of course, British Jews are going to be very, very concerned what's going on there, whatever your politics are. So, and of course, we're watching very close situation of Jews in the Ukraine, Jews in Russia, which is a really, really sensitive and important subject right now, Jews in Hungary, Jews in parts of Latin America. These issues are of tremendous interest to the Board of Deputies. Sometimes quietly, sometimes more boisterously, we engage ourselves in thinking about what's happening with Jewish communities around the world. So that's, in a sense, that represents the second model of political Jewish life. And the third one, as Karen says quite rightly, is when we take responsibility for wider issues. So perhaps the most well-known in recent times are the Uyghurs in China. I can't say Chinese Uyghurs, the Uyghurs in China, where the board has done a huge amount of work in speaking about on their behalf, hosting them here in London, signposting people how they can support them. And that's a really good example of what I meant by the third wave of British Jewish politics, Jews taking responsibility alongside other communal organisations on behalf of really important Jewish causes. We've also done some work. In fact, I can't see Owen. Is Owen in the room? I don't know if Owen's here, but Owen's been really important on behalf of the board working on our deputy for York. I'm blanking on his surname. Someone's going to help me. Thank you. He's done some really important work on the board thinking about disability issues. We've done a lot of work around gender issues, done a huge amount of work with refugees here in the UK and globally. And that represents the third wave of Jewish politics and how the board has got involved with it. Really thinking deeply, what are the causes that matter to all of our Jewish community, and what can we as the board do to give voice to those ideas and struggle on their behalf. So that's a little bit about how the board has seen and does see itself. Now, how do we do that? We do that through democratic representation. The Board of Deputies can only be as good as the deputies that you elect to sit with us. Now, actually, as a denomination, I'm going to say two things about you. One, your deputies are fantastic. Number two, there are not enough of you. There are not enough of you. There should be more liberal and progressive deputies at the Board of Deputies. So please go back to your communities and say, are we fulfilling our legitimate quota at the board? If you've got no deputies, send one. If you've got one or more deputies, but you're entitled for more, send them. Also ask yourselves, are you paying your full whack? Are you putting on your synagogue bills the £30 for a year per family unit, per unit for the board? We do not go out to the major donors of the community and raise £500,000, £200,000. We don't do that. Our power comes from our democratic representation and from the £30 that you put on your synagogue bills, and it's a voluntary contribution, and hopefully pay. The entire Board of Deputies budget is just over £1 million. We don't need more than that to function. We run a very tight ship, a very small office. Our power and our strength comes through our democratic representation and our voluntary contribution, our voluntary, if you like, tax that we ask the British Jewish community to pay. You send deputies, they represent you at the board. Now, your deputies don't always agree with each other. That's fine. They can be left-wing, they can be right-wing, on British politics. They can be left-wing or right-wing on Israeli or global politics. I don't care. What I care about is that they've got your community's interests at heart, they've got British juries' interests at heart, and they are sensible. Let me say that again. They are sensible. Okay? We have a very, very small, tiny number of deputies who take up a lot of Karen's time, who are not sensible. Very small, but they exist. Right? So please, send us wonderful, centrist, sensible, progressive deputies. That is what I need from you, because the better that your representation is at the board, the better your values and concerns will be heard, and the better British jury will be in terms of the work that we have to do. Why does this matter? Well, I couldn't believe this until I joined the board. But in actual fact, almost every day, we get phone calls from government or opposition or local government or senior civil servants or the global Jewish media or other faiths saying to us, what does the board think? What's the board's view on this? And ultimately, the answers that we give to that question will be determined by the quality of the deputies as a whole. So the better our representation is of British jury, the better those values will be heard. Out there, the board is recognised as the democratic, legitimate, representative body of British jury. It's recognised when we're called on by government or opposition or other faiths. It's called upon when Marie is invited to the funeral of our late Queen and to the coronation of King Charles. It's represented when it's when we all are invited to go as a privileged body, because the board is a privileged body in the eyes of the monarch, to go and petition the monarch. So it matters that the board is it's genuinely democratic, which it is. It also matters that the quality of our deputies is as good as it can be. You have got great deputies, but you haven't got enough. So send us more. I can see some hands up, and I'm actually going to stop, and I'll take as many questions or comments people have until Charlie or Karen tells me it's enough.
There's no question in Oxford's mind of the value of the Board of Deputies, and we're very supportive. But our deputy is just stepping down. How do I convince anybody to take it on? And what is the commitment?
Okay. So I'm really hoping that what I said just now would motivate you to have an answer, because it matters. It matters that Oxford is represented at the Board of Deputies by a wonderful deputy. The time commitment will range minimally from 2.5 hours a month on a Sunday morning. That's the minimum. Plus whatever you want to do locally to feed in to what your deputy does. The maximum could be being president of the board, which is pretty much a half-time, if not a full-time job. And there is everything in between those two extremes. So deputies can be on a committee, and which will be a couple more hours a month, or they could be on one of the divisions, in which case it will probably be 5 or 6 hours a month, and anything in between. So really you've got a full range of options, but the minimum is to come on a Sunday and give voice to your community at the board.
Do you work on Zoom?
Yes. All meetings are hybrid now. Yes, absolutely. Which makes a big difference, of course. By the way, it's had a negative effect. In the old days, pre-COVID, we would get close to 200 people coming on a Sunday. We now, if we get 100, we're lucky. But they're all there on Zoom. And so we've actually worked out quite well. Leo is here. Leo has done a brilliant job with us. Absolutely, deserved.
Okay, so it's...
in making the meetings hybrid.
Rabbi Leah, and then Alex, and then Ruth.
So I'm going to keep it short, but it's not a...
Sorry, there you are.
Here. It's not a question, it's a comment, because I really wanted to thank you also personally for the strong stance you took when Smotrich came to visit. I know it wasn't totally easy for the board, but I think for us as progressive Jews, it was really important that the lessons we learned from the Corbyn era was not just that we must defend ourselves, but that we cannot, when we say others need to stand up for us, expect to welcome with open arms racists who attack others. So thank you very much for that very clear stand.
Thanks, Claire.
So yesterday we had a meeting of Rabbi Josh Levy and myself talking about the new progressive movement, and round around the room, as we heard from people, one of the things that was really highlighted was the hope that with the new progressive movement that actually our representation, while we are definitely represented on the board, and I agree with you, we need more deputies, certainly the board's association with the United Synagogue as the default, and the chief rabbi of the United Synagogue being the default figure, is often one which is a struggle for our communities, and often means that we, however democratic it might be, it's not always the visual. And there is a real hope from our communities that with the emergence of a new progressive Jewish movement, that actually the board might support us in ensuring that the religious representation and the board's association might develop. Yeah. I didn't break my own rule by not really having a question there, but...
right. I mean, the point is very well made, Rabbi Charlie, and well taken. There's a 200 and whatever it is, 50-year history here that I think is a little bit of a challenge. I think having had the first reform president with Marie, which is extraordinary, in 250 years, the first reform president is currently the president of the Board of Deputies. I mean, it's amazing that it took so long, and we are there. But I think your point is very well made, and it will be something which will need to be looked at further. I don't disagree with you. Yeah.
Hi. Smaller communities, you are calling for more deputies. Smaller communities are only allowed one deputy at a time. So what happens if we want to send two?
Well, we have a very good answer for you. So you can certainly, particularly with under 35-year-olds, you can send observers. So we have a whole system in place for under 35s to be observers. So that is one way of resolving it. I don't really, at the moment in the current organisational structure, have a solution to send more deputies if you are a small community. I mean, Karen's on the Constitution Committee, and I think you would agree with that answer, wouldn't you? There isn't a solution for people who are older than 35. That's rather ageist of us in the other direction. But that's just how it is. The board's constitution, which is quite hard to change, as Karen knows, better than others, allows for under 35 observers. And we have many of them involved, and they are brilliant. They add a lot. But I haven't got a solution at the moment for over 35-year-olds if you want to have more than one. I'm really sorry, but we just haven't got it at the moment.
Ruth.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, I'm completely convinced by the value of the Board of Deputies. I know what you do. I speak to Marie. It's great. Mine's a rather prosaic question, really. I'm giving it, it's not Shabbat any longer. I think I can ask about the money. Sometimes when I'm sort of talking to people, they say, well, what does it cost? And I'm rather embarrassed to say, I didn't really know. I have a figure of 600 in my head, but I can't remember what that's for or why it is. Right. So if we could do that, because I think that's something we don't always ask, and then people, have got demands. Thank you.
So the board's budget, as I mentioned, is actually £1.2 million. So that's what it costs to run the Board of Deputies, of which we receive about £700,000 from a combination of communal contribution and deputy fees. And as you say, it's £600 per deputy. I think that's right. I mean, you've put that figure in my head now. I think that's right. We do, where there are communities who really cannot afford the deputy fee, we do have a system in place to help particularly new communities who want to get on board, reduce that fee. Because we don't want money to be a reason, if it's a genuine reason, why a synagogue can't send a deputy. So those two things. We get more income. We get a very significant grant from the World Jewish Congress because we are effectively their representative body in the UK. We have some investments, so we draw down some interest off investments, and then we do a very small fundraising campaign. So that's how the board's finances work.
Can I just check, isn't 600 on top of the 30?
Yes, absolutely. So we ask for a voluntary contribution on every shul bill of £30 per unit. So if you're not putting that on your synagogue bills, it's not fair. Please do, right? Because it means other people are carrying you. So every synagogue should put on their bill £30 as a voluntary contribution to the Board of Deputies, plus the fee per deputy. Yeah.
So just to clarify, it's individual Jewish people that have the option to spend £30 extra, which should be on your synagogue bill. It's the institution, your synagogue, that pays the £600.
Correct.
So,
that's exactly right.
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Becca? No. Oh, sorry. Okay, then.
We've got time for one last question.
Yep.
Hi, Michael. How long do deputies usually spend on the board or serve on the board? And do you think that, well, the time they spend there, sorry, I'll clarify. Sometimes you have deputies, certain figures that may start off at one community and then come to represent a different community or organisation on the board. And why do you think that is?
Right. So I'm going to unpack a few issues there. So some deputies just do one term, which is 3 years. Some deputies will, for whatever reason, want to do 2 or 3 terms and will do more than that. We've got 1 or 2 deputies who have been around for 50 plus years, and for them being on the board is really their commitment to the Jewish community. Some people enjoy the politicking of the board so much that when they can no longer represent, it might be their youth group, or it might be UJS, or whatever it might be, that they move to the next framework and then fight to become a deputy. So we do have those as well. One of the really interesting things is we don't have term limits. So one as a deputy, so one, like a member of parliament can be a member of parliament for 50 years, so too can one be on the board. So I go back and forth in my mind about whether that's good or that's bad. Probably if I was in a synagogue, I would want to have some deputies, 1 or 2 deputies who have got longevity, because that's good for memory and for really understanding, but also refreshing is also good. So I think you want a combination of both. But you also, I want to relate to one more point that not all of our deputies represent synagogues. So we also, as synagogue membership in the UK has declined across the board, we now also have deputies from organisations. but there it's a flat rule of 1 deputy per organisation. The only 2 exceptions to that rule are UJS, which I think is allowed 8, and AJEX, which has, do you remember how many AJEX has? Yeah, so AJEX, again, for good historical reasons, a British jury have more. Did I answer your questions? Yes, okay, great,
We've got
brilliant.
time for one quick, I hope it's quick, Mark.
Yes. Hi, Mark Shaw, Southgate.
Southgate, excellent.
Communication. So I think the board does a great job communicating the voice of British jury to whoever. Is there any work to do on the communication within? Communication to communal synagogues with not the detail, because the detail we see on our weekly, monthly emails, but the clear, short, concise, needs to be repetitive of this is what we do, this is what we're doing for you, and so that we all and our communities understand and continue to understand the good work that you're doing.
Well, so could we do better? 100% yes. And then, what do we have? So we have 2 short films right now, which explain the work of the board. We have a document which is 1 page long, and another one which is 6 pages long, which say what the board has done in the last year. Those have all been sent to your deputies. So what I can't do is make the deputy share it with the community. Right? We send it, it's there. So, and if anyone wants it, just shoot me an email via the board and I'll send it to you. But we have just produced the updated version, 1-pager, of what the board has done in the last year. So we do what we can. I totally recognise it might not be enough. And I know we're about to finish, so just one more thing to share with you. On July the 5th, we have the great privilege of hosting the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is going to be doing an interview with Simon Sebag Montefiore. And that is taking place at Bevis Mark Synagogue, where the board was established. And we have invited 5 people from every single synagogue who in some way is involved with the board. That means either they have a deputy or they're paying their communal contribution. So if you don't know about it, go and yell at your deputy. Right? So it's really important that, and I really hope that as many of you will come as possible to be part of that amazing, amazing experience. It's the first event of its kind that the Archbishop has done, and he's going to be exposing himself to any question that Simon Sebag Montefiore puts to him about British Jewry and the relationship with the Church of England. So that's a great thing. It's at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. The time is because that's what the Archbishop gave us. So it's not negotiable. We fitted in with his timetable.
Thank you. And you, unfortunately, need to fit in with ours because we could clearly go
Thank
on
you very
all
much.
day. Michael, huge thanks to you. Can I just say 2 quick things? Firstly, some communities put people out to grass by saying, okay, they're off council, thank God for that, let's make them deputies. Please don't do that. Please make sure we can't make the progressive voice as strong and as focused without articulate deputies. The second thing you all need to know, and this is very relevant to the person from Oxford, when you get up at the board, the first thing you say is your name, and the second thing you say is the name of your synagogue. So everything your deputy says, they say in your name. So it's really important that you have confidence in the deputies that you send. Thank you very much. That's it from me. I know Charlie wants to say something, and before I give the floor to Charlie, our comms people have asked all of the deputies here, if there are deputies here, could we come forward so that we can have a photo with Michael before he leaves?
But just
Charlie.
wait 1 second, and let me tell you, the sessions are about to start in 1 minute, so we're going to go. But I just want to remind you that Larry and Rabbi Rebecca Burke's session is in the Gloucester room, but it's not as advertised. It's the conversation across the Atlantic that was moved from yesterday. So it'll be a really great session. Larry, give us a wave. They're going to be in the Gloucester room. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Yeah.
Try now.
Now it's working for sure, yes. They can hear us in other sessions. Is this too loud? Is this... It's fine. So we're going to start in maybe 1 or 2 minutes. I think give people a time for transition. Some people are getting some tea. Oh, some people have to check out. Good point. I'm sorry? Yes, everyone. And by some people, I meant all the people. Oh, that's the fundraising program. They lock up the luggage and then they auction it to the highest bidder. Give people just 1 or 2 more minutes. For those who haven't met me, my name is Joel Hoffman. We are going to talk about 3,000 years of history. And so I thought what I would do is I would give you a little bit of a timeline, just so we know what we're talking about. So way over here, and I apologize to the Zoom people if I wander off your screen. If I do wander off the screen, I promise I'll come back. So we start 3,000 years ago. This is King David's kingdom, which I also mentioned during the keynote. And we have, sort of history behind that. And then walking over here, just to give you a sense, this is the conference that we're at. So that's the sense of the 3,000 years. So we can sort of find mid-post. This would be the year 500, for example, right in the middle. Somewhere around here is 1066, which is sort of a convenient date. This would be about a third of the way down. Over here would be the year 0, except there was no year 0. When they put the calendar together, they inconveniently forgot the year 0, so it goes right from +1 to -1. Or from 1 AD to 1 BC, or from 1 CE to 1 BCE, depending upon your preference. And then we have the Romans and we have the Greeks. This would be about the, well, depending upon your point of view, either the founding of America or when the king lost the colonies, somewhere around over here. And just for comparison, like this little picture frame over here would be larger than your entire life. So that's sort of a sense of how much 3,000 years is. But actually, we're going to start on the other side of the wall. I don't know what's over there. But we're going to start before 3,000 years ago. We're going to start about 6,000 years ago. It's a little bit like the Yiddish speaker who stands up and says, before I begin, I have a few remarks. So before we begin, we have a little bit of a pre-beginning. We're going to start on the other side of the wall. We're going to start 6,000 years ago. 6,000 years ago, there was no writing yet. And people are trying to figure out how to communicate. And someone got the idea that they could draw, I'm a little bit tired from walking over 3,000 years. Someone got the idea that they could draw little pictures of animals. And next to the pictures, they could use hash marks to indicate the quantity of animals. And this was important if you were into livestock, which pretty much everyone was, because what else could you do with your life except livestock 6,000 years ago? If you were, for example, giving somebody 7 goats, and you wanted to send a messenger with the 7 goats, you had no way before this of indicating it was 7 goats. You had to tell the messenger 7 goats, and then the messenger would show up to whoever you're giving the goats to, and he would say it's 7 goats, but you'd have to trust the messenger. You could not write down the fact that you were giving him 7 goats. And then someone got the idea, and it seems obvious to us now, but someone got the idea that you could draw a picture of a goat and make like 7 hash marks. And this was, believe it or not, an enormous leap forward for humankind. This was an unbelievable advance. For the first time in human history, people could communicate at a distance. For the first time ever, you could tell someone not in front of you something. If you'll pardon my grammar. You could tell something to someone not right in front of you. It was an incredible leap forward. You could draw the goats, you could write the hash marks, you could send the emissary. However, it was limited. You could not, for example, write, P.S., please say hi to your wife for me. You could maybe draw a picture of the wife, but that may or may not do good things for future business relations. It was nonetheless, and that's 6,000 years ago. That's like, if you picture the length of this room going way out into, I don't know, it's like the 3rd hole in the golf course or something. I don't know what it is. And that was a huge leap forward. The next leap forward came when people realized that these pictures didn't have to look like what they represented. And this brings us to the Egyptians. The Egyptians got the idea, and they really took this forward, that when you're drawing a picture of something, it doesn't have to look like what it is. That it's actually arbitrary. And in fact, they'd already had that idea, because when you draw the picture of the goat, you're really like just drawing like little stick figures. You're not like actually drawing a goat. You're not drawing like the ears or like the inner parts of the ears. It's not a photograph. It's reasonably abstract. There's a comedian actually who says his kid drew a picture of something, and the comedian looks at his kid and says, "What is that?" And the kid says, "It's our house." And the comedian takes his kid outside and says, "Do you see how it's not?" It was abstract. The Egyptians said, well, gee, we could draw pictures of things that are very hard to draw. It's one thing to draw a picture of a goat, but how do you draw a picture of, let's say, yesterday? How do you draw a picture of conscientious? How do you draw a picture of, I mean, even things like the sun. You have to have some agreed upon way of doing this. And that's what the Egyptians did, and these are called icons. This was an incredible leap forward for humankind, because now you could actually say, P.S., please say hi to your wife for me, when you were sending a message long away. The icons did not have to look like what they represented. And we actually still have icons, and more, as I'll tell you in a minute. But just for example, what is this? It's a heart. That's right. How many chambers does the heart have? 4. This looks nothing at all like a heart. The human heart has 4 chambers. This looks nothing at all like a heart. It's an icon. It's an agreed upon way of drawing things. And we use it in all sorts of things, like in the famous I Heart New York, I Love New York. I don't know if you have bumper stickers on cars here, or if you call them bumper stickers for that matter. But if you do, and if you do, some of them might say like I Heart London or things like that. But I suspect they probably don't do that here, do they? You're not allowed to have stickers on your car? What if you really, really love London? So anyway, we digress. So the point is, we use the heart for love. If we actually used a picture of a heart, it would kill Valentine's Day forever. Like, you know, if you sent someone a card, I saw this icky, yucky, drippy thing and I thought of you. You'd never get a response to that. We have other ones. What does a triangle on top of a square represent? A house. There are no houses that look like that. I've seen houses, they do not look like a triangle on top of a square, but that is a modern icon for house. That's what the Egyptians developed. And now we actually have emojis. We have more icons than we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or certainly than 50 years ago. And you have to know what they mean. You have like a smiley face is like, ha ha ha, but it's not really a smiley face. It's like, it's the 2 dots and the 1 dot and the little thing. And then there's like an upside down smiley face, which does not mean like a frowny face, like turn that frown upside down. The upside down smiley face, it turns out, means the same thing as the right side up smiley face, just more whimsical. So if you want to be whimsical, you send it upside, I don't know what that is. And if you've looked at your phone, there are all kinds of things on that phone. There is, for example, on my phone, a symbol that looks an awful lot like Instagram film, Instamatic film. Do you remember the cameras from a long time ago that you had a cartridge you would put in? And it had a spool on this side and a spool on that side, and you were connected, and you would just pop the spool in, and you'd take 12 pictures, then you would send it to whoever you'd send it to, and you get the photos in a week. So I have an icon like that of that old film on my camera, on my phone, which I use for a camera. And it turns out that what that actually represents is not the film, which nobody uses anymore, but it actually means I have voicemail. Because what it really represents is a cassette that nobody uses anymore. Remember the cassettes from the answering machines that we thought was the coolest thing in the world, like in 1982? And so that's the icon. And what this shows us is that the icons are sometimes pictographic, but sometimes antiquated, and sometimes completely and totally arbitrary. The Egyptians took this forward. They developed some 3,000 symbols. And now they could write down anything they wanted. And this is what made Egypt into a great society. And we're still, by the way, in the introduction. We haven't started yet. We're still on the other side of the wall. The Egyptians could write down anything they wanted. Now you could convey information, not just person to person, but you could convey information across space and throughout time. Now you could learn from somebody a generation before you, but also 3 or 4 or 5 generations before you. Now, for the first time, people could amass knowledge. People could learn from, people could compile libraries. People could consult people who had died. People could write reference books. This created Egypt. And they knew it. There is a surviving document from Egypt that talks about this. It talks about it in the context of how it worked. The 3,000 symbols were too difficult for the average person to learn. You could not reasonably expect the average person to learn 3,000 symbols. First of all, because their lives were so short. Nowadays you have like childhood, and then you have the preteens, then you have your teenage years, and then you have like you're a young adult and you're finding yourself, and then you have apparently there's a quarter-life crisis that I don't remember it existing way back when, and it's like 25 years to 30 is when you have your first crisis. Why wait till middle age? You can practice when you're 25 to 30. And then like you have like, you're a young adult, and then eventually you become an empty nester, and then finally, in antiquity, you were a child, and then you were an adult, and then you died. People regularly died in their 20s. And if you lived into your 30s, you were having a long life. King Tut was 17, for example. Most of the characters in the Bible were teenagers. They were older teenagers. Abraham, Isaac, not that they existed, but had they existed. You couldn't possibly spend 5 years learning how to read and write. You had to spend those 5 years procreating and moving on with your life. So what they did is they had professional scribes. And the scribes mastered the systems, and the scribes mediated the reading and the writing. So let's say you were a doctor. And they had very advanced medicine in antiquity. If you were a doctor, you would ask a scribe to write down what you knew, and you would ask a scribe to read to you the information from 2 or 3 generations prior. And so the scribes really mediated everything. And that was the drawback of the system. You needed the scribes. Without the scribes, you could not have this system work. And the doctors relied on the scribes, and the politicians relied on the scribes. And this is really what made Egypt go. They had a fantastically advanced medical system. In ancient Egypt, they could do a C-section on a woman, and she would live to give birth again. I don't think they could do that in this country 150 years ago. And that's England we're talking about. So that's how advanced medicine was back then. And they did that because of the writing system. And the writing system was made possible by the scribes. And I told you they knew about that because there is a surviving document that says there is no greater calling than to be a scribe. Now, a scribe wrote that. So, we're not 100% sure everybody felt that way, but they were right. That was what made Egypt so great, and that was another huge leap forward for humankind. No longer limited to drawing pictures of things, you could now draw anything you wanted with these symbols. These are the hieroglyphics that everyone is so enamored with. The next leap forward came when people decided that instead of writing down the meaning of the word, they could write down the sounds of the words. And again, this was a huge leap forward for humankind because now it meant you could write down names, you could write down sounds. If you made up a new word, you could figure out how to spell it, as it were. And the first way they did this is they did it with a syllabary. They made up a different symbol for each syllable. Remember syllables from grade school? Syllable. Well, that's what they did. They had one symbol for boo, one symbol for ba, one symbol for bee, one symbol for bi, and so on and so forth. And they ended up with about 600 symbols, far less than the over 3,000 the Egyptians had, much more manageable, but still beyond the reach of the average person. You couldn't reasonably learn 600 symbols in your short lifespan back then. And by the way, this is a very difficult task, figuring out what your sounds are. For example, in English, the last sound of dogs is not the same as the last sound of cats, even though they are both plurals. One is actually a Z and one is an S. They sound different. The first sound, let's put this, the P in the word pen does not sound like the P in the word spin, believe it or not. That's how hard it is to self-identify the sounds. The way you can tell, and I would invite you to do this now, though I realize we were just talking about this may be pushing the reserved British ethos a little bit too far, but put your own hand in front of your mouth and say pin, and you will feel an explosion of air. Put your hand there and say spin, and there's no explosion of air. The P's are different. There is an explosion of air, and if I do it into the microphone, you'll hear it pin versus spin. There's no explosion of air. So it's very difficult to figure out the sounds of your own language because you don't always know what your sounds are. Someone had to figure out the 600 syllables. Someone had to figure out that words come in syllables. Someone had to figure out that speech comes in words. All of that was difficult. They did this about, now we're talking somewhere in the ballpark of 4,000 years ago, so sort of on the porch over there. I apologize to the Zoom people who can't see the porch. There's a porch over there. And then came another innovation. Sumerians, thank you. The civilization was the Sumerians that were doing this. Then someone got the idea that instead of having hundreds of symbols for the syllables, all you really needed was the consonants. If you just wrote down the consonants, then you could whittle down your inventory of symbols to about 24. And the people who did this were the Phoenicians, which you may have heard of. How many people here have heard of the Phoenicians? That's what I thought. The Phoenicians decided that all you needed were the consonants. And with the consonants, you only needed 24 symbols. It was a much, much simpler system. It still was not perfect, though, because while it was fairly easy to write down your words, it was very difficult to read them, because there were no vowels. Of particular difficulty was reading a word that started with a vowel. So if we did this in English, if you had the letter T, that could represent the word tea or toe or tie or to, but also it, at, and ought. And those are harder for the human brain to process, a vowel that comes before the consonant with no indication of the vowel. And there are times when there might be conflicting words and you had no way of indicating whether it was toe or tie. And sometimes it might make a really big difference which one it was. That's the Phoenicians. It was also a huge leap forward. It was very, very helpful only to have 24 symbols instead of having hundreds or thousands of symbols. And now we get to the beginning of the lecture. Now we get to the wall over here. I know you can't see the wall. There's a wall over here. Now we get to King David 3,000 years ago. I told you yesterday that one of the things that the Israelites invented was the alphabet was writing. This is how it happened. They took the Phoenician system and made a seemingly minor modification to it. They doubled up 3 of the consonants, using the consonants not just for consonants, but also for vowels. Most important, they used the letter hey, which was an H, and they used that not just for the H sound, but also for the vowel ah. And there's actually a very innate connection between the H and the ah. We still do that. If you go to the doctor and the doctor sticks the thing down your throat and says, say ah, how do you spell that word? With like 3 A's and 4 H's, depending upon how far he sticks it down, right? We still use H for the sound ah. And the reason for that is when you're saying H and when you're saying the sound ah, your mouth is in the same configuration. And you could try this now. If you say ha, you will realize that your mouth does not change a whole lot, whereas if you say, for example, hoy, you will feel your mouth moving a lot. So the ah and the H have a natural connection, and the Israelites used their letter hey, the letter H, for the sound ah, and they used 2 other letters also for vowels. They used the letter yud, which was a Y, for the sounds E and A. Again, which we still do now. We have the word happy, which is spelled not with an I, but rather with a Y. And day, for example, has the letter Y at the end. Again, because there's a natural connection between the letter Y and the sounds E and A. And they used the letter Vav, which back then was a W, for the sounds O and U. And again, there's a natural connection. If you say the word woe, you will feel like it's a little bit of a movement, but not as much as there is, for example, with wow, for example. Wow, you can feel your mouth going back and forth. So they use the H, that is to say the hey for the sound ah, they use the yud for E and A, and they use the vav for O and U. And now they could write down anything they want, and anybody could learn the system. Because anybody, with the possible exception of Hebrew school students, can learn 24 and 27 letters. Now anybody could learn how to read and write, and they were expected to. You may have heard the rumor that ancient Israelite society was an oral society. Raise your hand if you've heard that rumor, that the Israelites were an oral society in antiquity. They were not. The way we know they were not is it says, Uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha. Write them on the doorposts of your house. If you have a commandment telling people to write things down, you do not have an oral society. Furthermore, we keep finding more and more archaeological evidence that even commoners, even poor people, knew how to read and write. We keep finding different handwritings from places where there are only very poor, uneducated people. Everybody knew how to read and write. As I said yesterday, that was important because they wanted wanted people to be able to read about their rights. Question? They spoke Hebrew at this point. 3,000 years ago was the beginning of Hebrew. This is what made writing possible. This was now the alphabet. Now you could write down anything you wanted. It was a risk. They took a risk back then. They wrote things down for the future. No one had ever done this before. It used to be that if you wanted to keep something alive, what would you do? You would memorize it. Again, we can look at the V'ahavta. Remember the V'ahavta? You're supposed to, not just Uchtav Talmuzot Beitecha, but you're supposed to recite them when you lie down and when you rise up, when you go on your way, and when you come back. Why would you keep saying something over and over and over again? To memorize it. The idea was you were memorizing it. Why did you have to memorize it even though you were writing it down? Because they didn't trust this newfangled technology. Back then, if you wanted to make sure of something, you memorized it just in case this whole writing thing didn't pan out. Speaking for myself, now it's exactly the opposite. If I want to make sure I still know something tomorrow, I better write it down. We now know writing works. They didn't know it back then. It was a brand new experiment. They were writing for the future. The experiment took off like wildfire. The Hebrew letters eventually became the Greek letters. The Greek letters became the Latin letters. Jump ahead to today. The letters that we use is still called the Roman alphabet. The font is like New Times Roman. We still use the font of from Latin, which is from Greek, which is from Hebrew. All of the writing in English, in French, in German, in Western Europe comes from the ancient Israelites. All of the writing in Eastern Europe is in Cyrillic, which they call Cyrillic, because what are you going to do with foreigners? That all dates back to Greek, which goes back to the Hebrew. The Arabic alphabet goes back to Hebrew. Even the alphabet of the subcontinent of India in some cases goes all the way back to Hebrew. Almost all of the writing anywhere in the world goes back to this experiment 3,000 years ago. The reason we can write this down, the reason we can do email, the reason you can make a shopping list, the reason you can have a newspaper, the reason you can have a document, treaty written down on a piece of paper is because of the ancient Israelites 3,000 years ago. And they gave us something else. They gave us the world's all-time best-selling book. How many people here have heard of the Bible? That's right. The reason you can read the Bible is because they invented the alphabet. Now, how many people here have heard a different story? How many people here have heard that the Phoenicians invented the alphabet? Does that ring a bell for people? I know that is what is still taught in some universities and in some schools, that the Phoenicians invented the alphabet. They did not. I asked you how many people have heard of the Phoenicians. How many of you have read any books by the Phoenicians? No, you can't, because they didn't have the alphabet. The Israelites invented the alphabet. They modified the Phoenician system. The Phoenicians came very close. They had the consonants. They didn't have the vowels. I'm not talking about the dots, the lines, and the other lines that you learn in Cheder. I'm talking about the actual consonants used as vowels. This is what made mass literacy possible. It is astonishing, something that has only been invented once across the whole globe throughout all of human history. Almost everything else, calculus was invented by two different people. Calculus is not easy. Gunpowder was invented in two different places. Kites, it's a pretty cool idea, kite, invented in two different places. The syllabic way of writing with hundreds of symbols was invented all over the world. The alphabet was only invented once. It was invented by the Israelites, the Jews, 3,000 years ago, right there on that wall in King David's kingdom. And this is what made everything else possible. And they seem to have appreciated the power of their system. They seem to know how amazing their Yud, Hey, and Vav were, especially the Hey. Remember the Hey, which is the H? That's what got everything going. They knew how amazing this was. What was Abraham's name before he was Abraham? What letter did they add to make Abram into Abraham? They put their magic letter Hey right in the middle of the patriarch. Avram is an ordinary word. It's a word in Hebrew, a word in Phoenician, a word in Canaanite. Av means father, Ram means exalted. Avram is just a tribal elder. You take an ordinary word and you stick the Hey right in the middle and you turn the tribal elder into our tribal elder. Same thing with Sarai and Sarah, and we can go one step further. There was an ancient word, Elim, which meant gods. You may know this word, Micha Mocha Ba Elim, that's right. Elim meant gods. What happens if you stick the hay right in the middle of Elim? You get Elohim. In other words, the patriarch, matriarch, and deity of the ancient Israelites all get their name from ordinary words with the magic hay stuck into the middle. And we can even go one step further. There is another way of writing God's name. You may know this. It's technically called the tetragrammaton, which is just Greek for four-letter word. But it doesn't mean what four-letter word means, because four-letter word means something else. It's just a word that happens to have four letters. You may know that in Hebrew, Yud, He, Vav, He is another way of writing God's name. Well, what letters are in that? The two He's that are especially magical, and the Yud and the Vav. These are entirely and only the magic letters that made writing possible in antiquity. Now, you may have heard the rumor that we have forgotten how to pronounce Yud, He, Vav, He. Does that ring a bell for anybody? We've forgotten how to pronounce the holy name of God? Yeah, there's no truth to that either. Raise your hand if it seems plausible that in a society devoted to worshiping God, they would forget God's name. That's a preposterous story. The reason we don't know how to pronounce Yud, He, Vav, He is that it never had a pronunciation. It was not meant to be pronounced. It was symbolic. It was just the vowels. It was as if saying, our God is so cool, you can't even write him because you don't have vowels. It wasn't our most mature moment, perhaps, but it turned out to be true. The Yud, He, Vav, He was a symbolic way of writing down God's name, just alongside Elohim, which was the word Elim, the word gods, with the He stuck in the middle. So what we see is 3,000 years ago, the Israelites took a previous 3,000 years of experiments in history, and in particular, they took the Phoenician way of writing, and they turned it into the alphabet, which spread around the world, and if that was all they had done, would have counted as an unbelievably important contribution to societies everywhere. It's what made almost all of the future development possible. They realized the value of those letters, and they used those letters to write the world's all-time best-selling book, the Bible. But here's what's interesting. The oldest actual copy of the Bible, and by this I mean what some people call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. The oldest actual copy of the Bible is only 1,000 years old. It comes from about here. This is how old the oldest copy is. Not 2,000 years, not 3,000 years. And so we have a reasonable question to ask: how far back does our Bible go? How do we know what the words were? How do we know what they sounded like? So just for example, we read in Jeremiah, Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted. Jeremiah was a little bit manic depressive. Jeremiah says, Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted. And then Jeremiah says, thus says the Lord, keep your voice from crying, keep your eyes from tears. Your children shall return. Okay, that's the manic part. How far back does that go? We read the Via Hafta, we read the Shema. How far back does that go? What does it sound like? Anyone here remember there used to be a holiday called Sukkot? And then all of a sudden, poof, now it's Sukkot. So which one is it? Did they pronounce it as Sukkot, or did they pronounce it in the Bible, or as Sukkot? Shabbos and Shabbat. There are other communities that pronounce the words differently. How far back does this stuff actually go? We are going to go back to about the 10th century CE and use that as our bridge between modernity and antiquity. About 1,000 years ago, there were a group, closer to 1,100 if you're keeping close track. By the way, once again, I see people taking notes, and of course you're welcome to do that. I do have a book about this with everything in it from NYU Press called In the Beginning, A Short History of the Hebrew Language. I want to be clear, I did not choose the title. NYU Press chose the title. They wanted it to be an impulse purchase. I told them I wrote that book, I wouldn't impulse purchase that. I wanted to call it a biography of Hebrew, but they didn't want to do that. It does contain everything I'm talking about and much more. It's an academic book, but as academic books go, it's not super hard. And if you look very carefully, there are jokes in the footnotes and in the index. But you have to look really hard to find them, because they wouldn't let me put jokes in the main text. About 1,000 years ago, a group of people lived called the Masoretes. And these are people who were living in and around the ancient Near East, and they put together a system of preserving the sounds of Hebrew, as they said. This is where we get the dots and the dashes from. You may know, for example, that a line under a letter in Hebrew represents the sound ah. You may know that 3 dots like this represents the sound eh. 3 dots like this represents the sound oo. 2 dots like this is either silent or not silent, depending upon where you learned Hebrew. This is the system that we know. This is called the Masoretic system. This comes from about 1,000 years ago, not 2,000, not 3,000. And according to their own writings, the Masoretes were trying to preserve the holy ancient sounds of Hebrew. However, and the reason they used the dots was they didn't want to change the holy ancient symbols. They knew that they had inherited this great writing system. They knew they had, for example, the Torah, and they didn't want to change the letters of the Torah. So what they did is they just put dots over the letters. They didn't want to add new letters. They just added little symbols called diacritics. Arabic was doing the same thing. They probably learned this from the Arabs. Here's what's interesting. Even though they say they were preserving the holy ancient manuscripts, all of those holy ancient manuscripts are gone. All we have is their writing. You know, what if I told you, for example, I discovered an incredibly valuable Ming vase, which you might call a vase, and it must be worth a gazillion pounds. And you say to me, where is it? I say, well, I have a photograph of it. And you say, where is the vase or the vase? And I say, yeah, I lost it. You might reasonably suspect that my photograph was a forgery. When the Masoretes 1,000 years ago say they are preserving the holy ancient manuscripts, and all of the holy ancient manuscripts are gone, we might reasonably suspect that it was a forgery. Now, spoiler alert, it was not. Someone told me once that a presentation should not be a mystery story. So we do have good news coming soon, but we have to figure out what's going on with this. What were the Masoretes actually doing? And in this regard, we need to take a step back and look at 3 different theories of the world. The first theory of the world is the God theory. The God theory is very simple. The God theory is that everything that happens because God makes it happen. So why did the sun rise this morning? In the God theory? God made the sun rise, that's right. Should the sun set this evening? Why will that be? Because God made the sun set, that's right. It's a very simple theory, and it explains everything. There are actually no flaws in the theory. There is nothing unexplained by the theory. Another theory is the dumb luck theory. I'll just take one more example just to be clear. If I shuffle a deck of cards, ace through king, and I keep shuffling it, and it comes out completely in order, why would that be in the God theory? God made it happen. God could do that. Piece of cake for God. God could also actually make a piece of cake. Another theory is the dumb luck theory. The dumb luck theory is that there are no rules, there is no God, and everything that happens is a pure matter of chance. So if, for example, the sun should rise again tomorrow morning, why will that be? Just dumb luck. And if it doesn't, we won't be around to know. So, you know, that's why we think the sun always rises, because as soon as it stops rising, poof, we're all gone. If I shuffle a deck of cards, ace through king, and it comes out in order, why is that? Chance, that's right. And that could happen. There is luck in the world, you know. Every week somebody wins the lottery, which is mind-boggling, but chance is out there. So we have the God theory, you have the dumb luck theory. I, by the way, know people who subscribe to the God theory. I know people who subscribe to the dumb luck theory. Let me tell you, very interesting things happen when you invite them both over for dinner. There's a third theory. The third theory is the science theory. The science theory is the theory that there are rules to the universe and that we humans can figure out those rules. In a sense, it's a preposterous theory. If I flip a coin, the best scientist in the world cannot tell me whether it will land heads or tails. And yet we have the audacity to believe that we can predict what is going to happen. We have the audacity to believe that there are rules and that we can figure them out. The philosopher Searle says that a dog does not know calculus. And I'm sure he's right, the dog does not know calculus. But then Searle adds, the dog doesn't even know that it doesn't know calculus. The dog does not sit around saying, gee, if only I knew calculus, I could calculate the area under the ball that was just thrown for me to fetch. The dog doesn't even know it doesn't know calculus. The science theory is the ridiculous suggestion that there is nothing like that for us, that we can figure out the world. We are going to use the science theory for the next little while, not because it's inherently better, but only because it's more interesting. There is nothing wrong with the God theory, there is nothing wrong with the dumb luck theory, but the science theory will give us a little more interesting time together. And the reason it's relevant is the Masoretes said they were preserving the holy ancient texts, and they said they were preserving the holy ancient sounds. Did they have any way of knowing what Hebrew sounded like 3,000 or 2,000 years ago? Well, the God theory says yes. The God theory says that these were God-inspired people and knew exactly what Hebrew sounded like. The dumb luck theory says, sure, maybe they stumbled across the right answer, but the science theory says no. The science theory says that you cannot figure out just by listening to how you speak, or even with an unbroken chain of oral tradition, what language sounded like a long time ago. And all we need do to verify that is look at English. How many people think that they know how Shakespeare spoke? That was only a few hundred years. That wasn't 1,000 years. That wasn't 2,000 years. For that matter, do you think that you have the same accent as even your grandchildren? Even in 2 generations, English has changed. That's only 2 generations. We're talking about dozens of generations over here. The Masoretes had no way of knowing what Hebrew sounded like. A fact we see from the work that they did. We can look at a couple of words. How do you say boy in Hebrew? Anyone know? Or how about king? Melech. Anyone know how to say queen? Malka. And Yeled and Yalda form the same pattern. There are a bunch of words in Hebrew that when you make them feminine, the sound changes to an ah. So you have, I'm doing the vowels with my fingers. So you have Yeled is a boy and Yalda. You have Melech is a boy king and Malka is a girl queen. Melech, Malka, Yeled, Yalda. Where do we get that system of the and the ah from? That's from the Masoretes 1,000 years ago. These are people living in Tiberias. They are the ones who put down the and the ah. The Masoretes in Tiberias, which we call the Tiberian Masoretes, because as I said yesterday, historians are nothing if not clever, were not the only Masoretes. There are also Masoretes in Babylonia who were called the Babylonian Masoretes. See, you could all be historians. They were called the Babylonian Masoretes, and the Babylonian Masoretes did not have different vowels in Yeled and Yalda, or in Melech and Malka. They had the same vowels. There's also a group of Masoretes from the land of Israel who are called the land of Israel Masoretes, and they had a third system. So what we see is there was disagreement 1,000 years ago over what the letters sounded like. You had a question? They did not invent masculine and feminine. What they say is, and we're going to see if it's true, they had the consonants. So if you think of the difference between masculine and feminine, it was the hey at the end, and that was written down in the text. The question was, do the vowels change? You know what it's like? We have vowels that change in English, though we do it differently in the US and in the UK. Sincere and sincerity is a good example. You don't say sincerity. You say sincerity. The word sincere becomes sincerity. And the other, if you had, what? Well, that's just 2 different ways of pronouncing the same word. But sometimes when you add an ending to a word, your vowels change. And that's what happens with Yeled and Yalda. And that comes from the Masoretes. And more generally, how do we know Rachel is pronounced Rachel and not Ruchel, for example, or Rochel, the way it is in Yiddish? You have a word Rivka. What's Rivka? Well, why is it 2 syllables or 3? Is it Rivka or is it Rebecca? Which one is it? We try and look at the Masoretes. Remember, the reason we're looking at this is that the Masoretes are our bridge between modernity and antiquity. We can see the Masoretic manuscripts. I have a facsimile in my office. You can look at it, you can see what they wrote down. We know that this is authentic. We don't know what the Masoretes were working with. And now we have troubling evidence. We see that they could not agree on the sounds of the unwritten vowels. We also have a question, did they make it up? There are some people who say the Masoretes just made the whole thing up. After all, there are no more ancient documents. So now we have to try and find out, were the Masoretes working from actual documents? How far back does the Masoretic, there's another example, Masorete, Masoretic. How far back does the Masoretic work go? Were the Masoretes reflecting sounds from 100 years ago? And what about the manuscripts? So to do this, we have to jump backwards. We're going to try and validate the Masoretic work. We jump back. What time are we supposed to be done with this? At 1:15 or at 11 o'clock? 11, right? Okay, good. It would make me so sad if you didn't get to hear the end of the story. Well, the next hour is going to be about the future. That's the really interesting part. So we now try and validate the Masoretes. The first step in validating the Masoretes, we go back to the 3rd century BCE. We go back to Alexandria, and we go back to a document called the Septuagint, which some people call the Septuagint, or Septuaginta. Septuaginta comes from 72. Well, it comes from 70, but we round it off. And the story is told as follows. The story is told that King Ptolemy, though in English we don't pronounce him Ptolemy, because in English we don't like words that start. We call him Ptolemy, the P is silent. Aaron Penkin, this is a side story, Aaron Penkin, alav hashalom, who died tragically too young, was president of Hebrew Union College, and when he was asked to spell his name, he would say, P is in psychiatrist. So we're going to call him King Ptolemy, we'll just swallow the P. King Ptolemy wanted to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And what he did is he got 72 elders from the 12 tribes of Israel and brought them down to Alexandria. And there he had them all work in isolation, putting each one by himself. And each one worked on translating the Bible into Greek. And they worked for 70 days. And at the end of the 70 days, the 70 scholars all came together. And wouldn't you know it, it turned out they had all produced exactly the same translation, proving that the translation was a God-inspired translation. It turns out it was actually a god-awful translation with very little to recommend it. As we talked about yesterday, they got virgin and young woman mixed up, which is where you get Isaiah's virgin birth. They got a lot of things wrong. It was a terrible translation, but it does in some sense validate the fact that there was something like the Bible existing in the 3rd century. Remember, the Masoretes lived 1,000 years ago. This is 2,300 years ago. If they were translating something from Hebrew to Greek 2,300 years ago, then it must have existed. But who's to say the Greek wasn't the original? Because we still have some copies of the Greek. And you look at some copies of the Greek, and some people, largely for anti-Semitic reasons, say, oh, I bet the Greek was the original and there never was any Hebrew. Well, we can dispute that. And here's how. We look at the Greek, and there are some alphabetic acrostics in the Bible. There are, remember the Ashrei? Ashrei goes Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. Well, you look at it in Greek, and it is not an acrostic. So therefore, we know that the Hebrew was the original. It is preposterous to assume that they wrote something in Greek only for it to be translated into Hebrew 1,200 years later, and people go, wow, it's the alphabet right there in front of us. When you have an alphabetic acrostic, clearly that was the original language. So we know the Septuagint was a translation of the Hebrew, and we can now push the text of the Hebrew way back from 1,000 years ago to 2,200 or 2,300 years ago. And there are other reasons we know that the Hebrew was the original, and that is word plays. There are puns in the Hebrew Bible. Let's think of a lot of the names, for example. Yitzchak. Why is Yitzchak called Yitzchak? Anyone remember? Because of the laughter. That only works in Hebrew. The Greek word for Isaac has nothing to do with the word for laugh. So that's how we know the original was in Hebrew. But what about the sounds? What did this sound like? Did they pronounce it Yitzchak? Now, there are lots of ways of figuring out ancient sounds. And in fact, when I was researching the book in the beginning, I thought I would just look up what the Hebrew sounds were. And the way most scholars figure out what the Hebrew sounds were is they base it on Greek. But I got curious. Well, how do you know what the Greek sounded like? And so I got a book called Vox Graecae, The Sound of Greek, and I read how we know what the Greek sounded like. And I should have guessed this. We know it from Latin. So I got curious, and I bought a book called The Sounds of Latin, and I wanted to know how we know what Latin sounded like. You know how scholars know what Latin sounded like? From the Hebrew and the Greek. The whole thing is circular. Everybody thinks the next department over knows more about it than they do. Hold on one second, even nowadays, across the pond, we have a difference between beta and beta. You go alpha, beta, I think here, if I remember correctly, for the Greek alphabet. And in the States, we say alpha, beta. Which one is right? We have no way of knowing. It is remarkably difficult to know what ancient sounds sounded like. The only really reliable, there are two reliable ways. The really reliable way is if you have a recording. They didn't have a recording app on their phones 2,300 years ago. They didn't have phones 2,300 years ago. They didn't have tape machines. Or you can write down the configuration of the mouth. And then you will know the sounds. The people who wrote down the configuration of the mouth were the people speaking Sanskrit. We do know what ancient Sanskrit sounded like on the Indian subcontinent. We do not know what Greek sounded like. We do not know what Latin sounded like. We do not know what Hebrew sounded like, though we're going to get some clues. And just by the way, we also don't know what Egyptian sounded like. That's purely speculation. You had a question?
It's kind of relevant, but mostly it's funny. Is that okay?
If it's short.
Some of the clues we have about Latin come from Latin teachers complaining about spelling mistakes and pronunciations that their students make.
Oh, this actually is both funny and helpful. Because there are some minor ways to figure out what ancient sounds sounded like, and that is from spelling mistakes. If you look at an ancient text and you see, for example, that people mix up two letters in graffiti, you can reasonably assume those two letters sounded similar. So, for example, my spelling is atrocious, as I mentioned yesterday. I mean, like really atrocious. I usually can't get it close enough for spell check to do the rest. The letters that I mix up are things like S and C. It's embarrassing, in really, really simple words. Innocence. Like, I don't know, is that an S or how would I know? And the reason, I never mix up C and L, though, because they don't sound the same. So someone would look at the C and the S and they would know, or even T and D. Could be mixed up sometimes, in American accent anyway. Not if you're going to say water, that's very clear that it's a T there, but the water, you never really know. You look at modern Hebrew and a samach and a sin are often mixed up or there's an aleph stuck in for no reason. So that is one way we can figure out a little bit which letters sounded the same. But we have much bigger questions. We want to know, for example, the name Rivka, we want to know whether it's 2 syllables or 3 syllables. And here there's good news. We can look at the Septuagint. It was a terrible translation, but sometimes they transliterated names. So when they wrote the word Rivka, they wrote it in Greek letters, and the Greeks had vowels for every vowel. The Hebrews only used vowels when they needed to. Back then, spelling was a matter of opinion. It's sort of coming back. The Greeks used a vowel for every single symbol. So in Greek, they wrote the word Rivka as Rebecca, as a trisyllabic word, not as a bisyllabic word. So it seems that Rivka is actually not the original pronunciation. It seems that the original pronunciation of the word was Rebecca, that it was 3 syllables, not 2 syllables. It seems that the Masoretes did not get it entirely right. They got the number of syllables wrong, they got the pronunciation wrong, based on the evidence from the Septuagint, which is not perfect, but is pretty good. It's worth mentioning there are a few other examples. There's a Latin example from a little bit later. There's a 6-columned commentary on the Hebrew Bible written in Latin, including a transliteration in Latin letters. There are a handful of other things, and they all confirm exactly the same pattern. The pattern is that the sounds have been continually changing over the hundreds of years to the point that when the Masoretes wrote things down, they no longer knew or could record what the ancient Hebrews sounded like. Another example would be the word lo. What does lo mean in Hebrew? Not or don't or no, that's right. Now in the Bible that's written as only 2 letters, a lamed and an aleph. There is no vav in the middle indicating the O sound, as you might expect. So scholars said, see, they couldn't even get that right. The original pronunciation must have been la. It couldn't have been lo. Probably the Masoretes who put the dot between the lamed and the aleph, and if those Masoretes made it up. However, there is one more bit of evidence that we can use. And for this, we jump ahead to the 1940s, where a Bedouin in the desert has lost his goat. Don't you hate it when that happens? The Bedouin has lost his goat. It's actually a couple of kids. They've lost their goat. They don't know where it is, and they're wandering around. And as kids will do, they are like, they're picking up stones. They're seeing how far they can throw the stones. They're probably throwing them at each other. One of the kids has a stone. He throws it, and instead of going thud, as a stone ought to on the desert floor, it goes bing. And he goes, that's interesting. But let's go find our goat. And they finally find the goat, and they bring the goat back, and everything is fine. But the kids are curious about the rock that went bing. So they go back, and they climb up a little hill, and they realize that there is a natural skylight of sorts into a cavern, which one could presumably enter, but from which one could presumably not exit. And so they have the sense not to jump down into the cavern, but they keep looking around, and they find an entrance to what turns out to be a cave of sorts. And they go into the cave, and therein they find vessels that seem to be old, and they find parchment upon which things they cannot read have been written. And so they bring them all back to the tent, and for a little while, these are conversation pieces. The neighbors come over, and they say, "Oh, I see you have these scrolls." "Yes, we have these scrolls." It was a short conversation because they couldn't read them. Then they got the idea that maybe they could sell the scrolls, and they went to a guy named Kondo, K with a K, who lived in Bethlehem. Kondo was a dealer in antiquities. Sort of the way, I don't know, someone named Vinny or Butch might be a dealer in used cars, if you know what I mean. This wasn't the most reliable guy in the world. He was sort of a wheeler dealer. He liked to get things done, and he bought these 7 scrolls, and he now tries to sell these scrolls, but the problem is they were found in the middle of nowhere. And he thinks to himself, wouldn't it be better if they had been found in the holy city of Jerusalem? So he goes to a cleric in Jerusalem, and with the cleric in Jerusalem, he conspires to sell these as the Jerusalem scrolls. No one knows what's on them, and they're trying to sell them. In the meantime, though, the war for independence of the state of Israel breaks out, and what used to have been Transjordan, where this was found, is now in Jordan, and there are hostilities, and there's a green line, and they can't get there, and things are fighting. And depending upon who tells the story, these scrolls, which are now split up into 2 different groups, are either taken to America for safekeeping, or they are smuggled out of the country under cover of darkness. They now try and sell 4 of the scrolls, 3 of them having been bought by somebody else, and they have trouble finding a buyer for the scrolls, perhaps because the legality of scrolls that were found in the desert and were sold under false pretenses as having come from Jerusalem and taken out of the new country of Israel that used to be Transjordan and brought to New York, their legality is not clear. And so they had trouble finding a buyer, though you can still see the advertisement, which you might call an advertisement, in the Wall Street Journal, right next to an offer for a timeshare. It cracks me up. In the meantime, some of the scrolls are still floating around, and there's a graduate student who looks at the scrolls, and this graduate student has in his possession a device, which is essentially a box with a sort of a hole in the front of it, and the back of which is a light-sensitive material called film. And he can use this device to make a photograph. And he does that. And I sort of mock it, but back then, most people could not do this. Back then, most people could not create a photograph. People were not walking around with cell phones everywhere. And even the cameras we talked about, the Instamatic cameras, were not around. It was very difficult to take a photograph. He takes a photograph of one of these scrolls that the Bedouin found in the desert, and he shows the photograph to people, and it looks like it's the entire book of Isaiah. If it is the entire book of Isaiah, and if it is truly ancient, because it looks like it's 2,000 years old. If it's really the book of Isaiah, and if it's really 2,000 years old, then it would be fully 1,000 years older than the Masoretic documents, and it would push back our documentary evidence fully 1,000 years. It would double the length of our documentary evidence. And if it's 2,000 years old, then it's easy to push it all the way back 3,000 years. And it's very clear the book of Isaiah. The problem is they don't know how old it is. How are they going to figure it out? They can't use carbon dating. Anyone know why? Well, it had been invented, but they couldn't use it because in order to carbon date something, you had to destroy it. You have to burn it, and then you can analyze the carbon. And they were quite reasonably unwilling to destroy something, only to figure out, oops, should have kept that one. What they did instead is they analyzed the handwriting. They looked at the handwriting and they said, from the handwriting, we can figure out how old it is. Now, some people said that's absurd. I would have been one of the naysayers. I'm pretty sure if you look at my handwriting, you'll conclude I was born in the Middle Ages. They looked at the handwriting and they came to the conclusion that the scroll was probably approximately 2,000 years old, that they probably got it right, and it pushed things back 2,000 years. And now the race is on. Now they go and find other scrolls. These eventually became what are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. This changed scholarship forever. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are a gazillion stories. It started off with the goat, and someday we'll talk about it. We don't have time. There's a goat. There's a partridge involved in the story. Did you know that a partridge is a bird? Everyone knew that except for me, right? Yeah, yes, why is the partridge in the pear tree if it can fly away? That's what confused me. If I was a... He's eating a pear. That's where its nest is? All right. I never knew that a partridge was a bird. I wrote it. I didn't know what that is. I live in New York. We don't have these things. But yes, a partridge is a bird, and there's a partridge in a pear tree. There's also a partridge that a guy was chasing, and he found another cave. There's a conspiracy. There's a cartel. The Vatican got involved. The TRS-80 computer, which some people may remember, was involved in this, is a televangelist from Virginia. I'm not going to go through the whole story, but I can tell you that now, many years later, the scrolls have been conclusively, accurately dated. They use something called AMS, accelerator mass spectrometry, which can analyze something without destroying it. And it turns out the handwriting people got it exactly right. These scrolls are 2,000 to 2,300 years old, and they contain every book of the Bible except for the book of Esther, except for the Megillah. We don't know why. And they confirm almost everything from the Masoretic document. The Masoretes got almost every letter of the Torah right. There's one little typo, a scribal error. And they got almost all of the rest of the Bible right. The Dead Sea Scrolls are amazing confirmation of the Masoretic work. And who can guess or who can figure out how they spelled the word lo in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Lo meaning not, the Hebrew word lo. Lamed Vav Aleph is exactly right. They confirmed even some of the vowels of the Masoretes. The Masoretes were better at their job than anyone ever thought. They were better at recording the sounds of ancient Hebrew. So we now know that the Masoretes gave us almost exactly the right text and a surprisingly close rendition of what Hebrew sounded like. We're able to authenticate things going all the way back 3,000 years. We have only one more piece of the puzzle. For this piece of the puzzle, we jump to the 19th century, to the shtetl, to Eastern Europe, where a man is born about whom they would later say that the love of Hebrew burned within him. He's born in the shtetl. He is a prodigy. By the time he is 5, he has already learned how to read Hebrew. He didn't speak Hebrew, of course. Nobody spoke Hebrew. Hebrew had dropped out of use somewhere around 2,000 years ago. That's why we didn't know anything moving forward. By the time he was 5, he could read the Torah in Hebrew. By the time he was 7, he could read the Talmud in Aramaic. He is a linguistic prodigy. And his proud parents did what any proud parents would do with a linguistic prodigy. They sent him off to rabbinic school, to the great yeshiva where he would learn to be a rabbi. Along the way, this guy, he's after his bar mitzvah, he's on his way, and he goes off to study in the yeshiva, and he gets an idea. He looks around him, and he says the ancient empires the modern empires, his modern empires, are being broken up, and lands are being returned to their ancestral owners. Greece is going back to the Greeks, and the way he sees it, eventually the Jews are going to get their land too, and he says there should be a language, and he says, wouldn't it be great if we used the ancient language of Hebrew to talk about modern things? And he goes to the yeshiva and he tells them, we should use Hebrew to talk about modern things. Wouldn't that be great? At the yeshiva, they say no, and they kick him out. He now wanders around Europe, learning more languages. He learns English and German and French. He's especially fond of French because he's especially fond of his French teacher, whom he later marries. He's not 13 anymore. He's not a whole lot older. And he now moves to Israel, and he doubles down on his philosophy that people should actually speak Hebrew, which we haven't done for 2,000 years. He is a little bit crazy, actually. He refuses to speak anything at home except for Hebrew, which is a little bit of a problem because his wife doesn't speak Hebrew. People who visited their house say that it involved more than a little pantomime and more than a little chaos. Things got worse when he had a kid, and this kid grew up in this confused environment, but he worked tirelessly. His name is Eliezer Ben Yehuda. He worked day and night to revive the Hebrew language. He started inventing modern words to talk about modern things. He started putting together a dictionary. Along the way, making up the Hebrew word for dictionary. The word milon in Hebrew was made up by Eliezer Ben Yehuda. He worked over and over and over again trying to get people to speak Hebrew. He would walk around Jerusalem where nobody spoke Hebrew, and he would speak Hebrew. He would try and buy bread in the morning from the baker in Hebrew. It would be like, before England was here, like before Rome was here even, like 2,300 years ago, there were native people here speaking what? Like some sort of like Celtic, right? But not the modern Celtic. It was like, so imagine if there was someone who, where are we? It's not in Livingston. What's the name of this place? Daventry, yes. Imagine someone walked into Daventry and tried to like hire an Uber in Celtic. I mean, that's what this guy was like. That's what he was doing in Jerusalem. And this all came to a fore when there was a university to be built in Israel. And of course, the language of instruction was going to be German, the holy language of academia. They called this place the Technikum because it was going to be in German. And Eliezer Ben Yehuda said, no, why don't we have the language of instruction be Hebrew? People said to him, well, Eli, they didn't call him Eli. Well, Mr. Ben Yehuda, there are 3 problems with having the language of instruction be Hebrew. There are no textbooks in Hebrew. The faculty doesn't speak Hebrew, and the students don't speak Hebrew. It would be like somebody establishing a university in Celtic. Who exactly would go to that university? You have to go to Cork. What? Yes, but I'm talking about ancient Celtic, not the modern Celtic. I'm talking about the ancient Celtic that even the Celts don't understand now. So this is what Eliezer Ben Yehuda wanted to do. The project was put on hold because of the First World War, but then after the First World War, largely with the intervention of the American board, Eliezer Ben Yehuda won this fight, and instead of opening as the Technikum, the university opened as the Technion. And it was the first institution of higher learning in native Hebrew. When they had a child, Itamar became the first native speaker of Hebrew in 2,000 years. In a probably apocryphal but still endearing story, it is reported that Itamar's first words, the first modern words of Hebrew, his first words were Lo lehit lachem, stop fighting. From there, things spread. Everybody started speaking Hebrew, and the Declaration of Independence for the State of Israel was signed in 1948. It was signed by largely Eastern European refugees. It was signed in Hebrew. Hebrew was reborn. You can go to Israel. You can send email in Israel. You can see in Hebrew. You can see signs in Hebrew. You can make shopping lists in Hebrew. The language that was dead has been revived. We can now speak modern Hebrew. And we can go one step further. We can go back to Jeremiah. Remember Jeremiah? Jeremiah who said, Rachel is weeping for her children, for they have gone. And then Jeremiah says, thus says the Lord, keep your voice from crying, keep your eyes from tears, your children shall return. When Jeremiah talks about Rachel, Jeremiah is talking about Israel. He's talking about the exile. Jeremiah says to Israel that Israel's children have left. And he says, keep your eyes from tears and your voice from crying, your children will return. Well, it took 3,000 years to go from King David. It took the exile, and it took the Septuagint, and it took the Latin, and it took all of this, and it took the Masoretes, the 3 different kinds of Masoretes, and let us not forget about the lost goat and the partridge. But after all of that, Jeremiah's prophecy came true, and we are the generation that lived to see Rachel, that is to say, Israel's children return. Not only that, the prophecy came true. Within walking distance, of the original experiment 3,000 years ago that made it possible in the first place, and that is the history of Hebrew. Thank you very much for your attention. We have 1 minute or 2 minutes for questions. Yes?
Right. I must say that was absolutely fascinating. I just want to ask two questions in one very quickly. Some years ago in London, I heard Geza Vermes give an absolutely fascinating talk on the Dead Sea Scrolls. What language did the Essenes write or speak in? And where does Aramaic come in all your discussions?
Two great questions. One about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which may or may not have been written by the Essenes. Let's assume they were. The Essenes spoke Hebrew. They wrote in Hebrew. They used a different font, but they wrote in Hebrew. And in terms of Aramaic, Aramaic was the lingua franca, the spoken language among the ancient Near East. So, for example, when someone from Jerusalem was doing business with someone elsewhere, they probably did it in Aramaic. I suspect, but I can't prove, that Aramaic was a slang form of Hebrew. I don't know that for sure, and we don't have time to go into the reasons, but I have reason to believe that Aramaic was a slang form of Hebrew. It was not considered a wholly different language. Sort of like Street English and the Queen's English, or even more we have a photographer in the room. Yes, that's a great question. Thank you very much. Aramaic. People say Aramaic was before Hebrew, but I have found no evidence of it. And I've seen no evidence cited. They say Aramaic came into existence about 1200 BCE as opposed to 1000 BCE, but I have not seen any evidence of it. It looks like Aramaic was just the slang. It was the spoken form, the informal form of Hebrew. Eventually, people only spoke Aramaic. By the time we get to the Talmud, 400s, 500s, people only spoke Aramaic. The Talmud was written in Aramaic. Jesus probably spoke Aramaic. The denizens of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago spoke Aramaic. The Dead Sea Scroll people probably also spoke Aramaic in addition to Hebrew. Great questions. Yes?
Okay, I think this is the very last one. I'll give you the mic.
Thank you. You said that we don't know how the ancients sounded, but do you believe that someone from King David's time could have a conversation with someone today in modern Israel?
What a great question, Denon. Could someone from King David's time have a conversation with someone in modern Israel? Not a spoken conversation, but a written conversation. You'd have to be careful. There are a lot of words that King David wouldn't understand, like telephone and things like that. And the grammar is considerably different, but there's still a lot of intelligibility. In terms of the distance between the two languages, I would say the distance between King David's Hebrew and what am I going to do? Benjamin Netanyahu's Hebrew is roughly the same as the distance between modern English and Shakespearean English. We have sadly run out of time. We have to vacate the room. We're using it for another keynote. Thank you once again very much for your attention. It's been a treat speaking with you.
conference.
Yeah, yeah, all the materials and everything. It's great.
And his dad passed away on April Fool's Day.
Wow.
Which was very harrowing.
Hopefully his dad had a good sense of humor.
Yeah.
Oh, then he would have appreciated
Ready
it.
to go? Okay, friends, we are really starting now, so it's not too bad. We've run pretty to time over the conference. Leo, forgive us. So I'm really delighted that we have with us this weekend and on this stage this morning, Rebecca Soffer. Hopefully you've looked in the programme and read your bio, and I'm not going to give it again because I think that they're going to get to know you a little bit over the next hour or so. But Rebecca is the author of Modern Loss, an interactive guide to moving through grief and building your resilience. And I think after this session, you're going to want to get this book. I know some of you already have it and have been talking about it, but it will be with Janet in the reception. Janet will be packing up after lunch, but up until then, you've got a chance to get the book, and I think you're even going to be signing some for us. So thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's a little bit odd in the middle of a conference where we're talking about liberal Judaism matters and lots of excitement in the room and energy, and suddenly we come to this point in the conference and we are introducing a new speaker and we're talking about loss. But before we kind of get into why I think it's so relevant that you're here, maybe tell us a little bit about Modern Loss, about the work that you do, who you are, in words that the bio can't tell us.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you so much to everybody here at the conference, everybody who's been so warm and welcoming, all the attendees who I met last night. It's been on my radar and on my highlight list in my calendar for many, many months now. So it's one of those things you can't actually believe is finally happening. I'm thrilled to actually have gotten here geographically. And I'm awake, which is also great with jet lag. So thank you so much. I'm delighted. And yes, why invite another American into this British coven here, and a really loud New Yorker at that, to talk to you about grief on the second day of your conference. It seems like out of left field, right? So I'll tell you a little bit about why I talk about this stuff in the first place. I'm shocking, I'm American. I grew up in Philadelphia, but I'm a New Yorker. Really? Amazing. There's one Philly person. Amazing. I'm a New Yorker. I lived there for 20 years in Manhattan. And I always wanted to be, I grew up, I know that there are a lot of people in this room who they work with end of life. They do pastoral care. They do hospice work. They do social work. There are so many people who I've met in the last day who, that's been their calling. They do death doula. They sing for the dying. They help the bereaved. And that is all really amazing, holy work, even if it's done outside of the auspices of religious structures. And I commend that. I was not one of those people. I didn't grow up wanting to be a social worker or a clergy person or a therapist or any of that stuff. I grew up wanting to be a journalist and an intergalactic DJ because I was a normal human child. That's what I wanted. And I still want to be an intergalactic DJ. And I think that it still is within the realm. I saw Jeff Bezos went to space for like 30 seconds. So it may yet happen. But so I wanted to always, I'm a storyteller. That is what I do. My father had an advertising agency. My mother is a writer and a publisher, so I come from a family of storytellers. And I always wanted to tell stories that I felt were important, but in my own voice, right? And so with that, what did I do? I went to Columbia Journalism School for my master's degree, and upon graduating, promptly decided that instead of working for a newspaper or for, Live at 5 news broadcast, where it felt very sensationalized, just like it does, let's be honest, in the news here, I took a left turn and I started a job working for a comedian named Stephen Colbert. So is anyone familiar with him? Okay, he's literally, just rest assured, he is a mensch. He is the best. He's an awesome guy. I was a producer for his show called The Colbert Report. And a lot of people said, wow, you got your journalism degree from Columbia and you're never going to pay back all of your student loans because no one goes into journalism to make any money. But why are you working for Comedy Central? Why are you doing satire? And I said, well, because I feel like this is more journalistic than anything that is in straight journalism right now, or 98% of what's like strict journalism, because in satire, you get through really important messages and you have to know what you're talking about because you can't make fun of anything. You will have no credibility if you're ridiculing something and you're wrong about it. You need to be journalistic about it, and then you also have to have a really good sense of humor and be a little weird. And luckily, I had both of those, I don't know if they're talents or skill sets or fallacies or deficiencies, but that's who I am. And so I started working for him because I felt like when you're in satire, you're able to get across messages that can be very overwhelming, very kind of hard to engage with, maybe like a little scary to talk about everything from dictatorship to, what is Bitcoin? How does that work? Like, what is that sense? But you watch a satire show, and all of a sudden, after a half hour, you realize that not only do you kind of understand it a little bit more, but you're not scared. You kind of want to come back for more because it's delivered in the right way. It's delivered with warmth and with a little levity, and it's entertaining. But it's also very clear that it's important for you to know about. So this is germane because while I was working for Stephen, we were nominated for an Emmy Award, and I got to go to LA. I got to go to the Emmys. It was all very exciting. I had just turned 30. This was all, I felt like my career was starting to cook with gas. I was really starting to live my life. And in Manhattan, when you're 30, that is like being 18 anywhere else in the world. Because you're still, you're living in a place that's that size, with your college era furniture and you're barely affording life and you feel like you're really an adult finally at 30. And so I felt like I was really in build mode of my life, and then life threw me a curveball. So I went to the Emmys, and then I went camping with my parents in upstate New York. It's a place called the Adirondacks, and it is where we went as a family every single year my entire life, camping on this beautiful island, no electricity, no running water. It sounds like hell to probably most of you. To me, it's like heaven on earth. And my father, his name is Ray, he started going there many decades beforehand. So it was really our ritual as a family. Every summer I knew I would have that time with my parents to connect. And everything else in the world and life changed and evolved and shifted, but that place stayed the same. And so I was really lucky that I got to have 5 days on a campsite with them, because the night that we drove back, my parents dropped me off at my apartment in New York, and then they drove to Philadelphia, where I grew up, about a 2-hour drive. And I got a phone call about an hour after my parents left me in my apartment that there had been a terrible accident and that I really needed to get to a hospital in the middle of New Jersey as soon as possible. It was midnight on September 4th, which is Labor Day, which is a huge national holiday. So I miraculously made it to this hospital and learned that what I now describe as the after of my life was starting, because my mom had not survived this accident. There was an awful accident on the highway. She did not survive. My father was in the car. He did survive. He was pretty banged up. And so from one second to the next, I went from being somebody who had kind of understood loss because my grandparents had died, and I had a friend when I was a teenager who wasn't one of my best friends, but she had died, but I didn't really closely engage with it. But all of a sudden, I was living in the world of after, and I became incredibly intimately acquainted with how isolating it is to live and grieve in our culture, right? And how we stigmatize the topic, and how we make people feel othered when they're going through it, even though, spoiler alert, we're all going to grieve. I mean, some of us just are faced with profound loss earlier than others. It's not a matter of if, but when. So not to take up the whole session with my backstory, but the reason that I'm here is because less than 4 years after that, my dad died. So I was 34, I had 2 dead parents, I had one career that had to keep going in New York, I had a new husband, I wanted to hit all of these milestones in life, and I didn't know how to do that. Like, I didn't know how to navigate build mode and loss mode, even though what I've realized since is all of life is build and loss mode. How do you navigate all of that? And how do you do it while still staying connected to the world around you and staying connected to your community, and also being able to support other people, because you probably want to be a good friend to other people and a support to other people. Like, how do you talk about hard things and moving through hard things, not just in a commiserating way, and in a way that's anchored in platitudes? How do you do it in a way that's casual, with friends, on dates, you know, in community, at bars? How do you just pull something that is so stigmatized out of the shadows and do it in a way that is just casual and real? Because that is what loss is. It's messy, it's real, it's funny, it's gut-wrenching, it is all the things. And we also want to focus on the life-affirming aspect of it. So Modern Loss, in a nutshell, is an online publication that I launched 10 years ago that is, it's singularly, you know, the singular mission is to destigmatize the topic of grief and loss. And we have a global readership, and I do lots of talks, and I've written 2 books, and it is all meant to kind of help people to feel less isolated in an individual experience. That no matter what is individual, but we go out of our way to make it isolating.
I mean, so much that I'm sure all of us want to ask you following that. But just for us, in the moment where we are in the conference, and I kind of opened with that, which is particularly on that last sentence that you said about the individual within the communal, why is it so important for us to make space in these sorts of environments on the kind of very upbeat, doing the building piece, we're doing a lot of the building piece, to make time to create spaces to talk about loss?
I think it's so important because I feel like, look, in America, we like fixing things, right? Like, I mean, everything is broken there, by the way. Like, we're doing a terrible job. Instead, we're like dismantling any structure that makes sense. But we have this can-do attitude, like, oh, when people are faced, they get a cancer diagnosis, you'll fight this, like, you're gonna win. Or like, if somebody dies, they said they lost their battle. It's all about like winning and losing, and are we doing it right, are we not doing it right? We talk about things in terms of grief, like 5 stages of grieving, and if you can check them off, then you're doing them right. And the dirty secret is that actually wasn't written for the bereaved. It was written for people who are dying. That is what the 5 stages of grief were meant for. But we like bite-sized things that seem to teach us what we are supposed to do when hard things happen that don't make sense and don't have a roadmap. The problem is that grief doesn't have a roadmap. It's all over the place. It affects your identity, how you parent, the choices you make, maybe how you choose to live. It affects so many different things. And so I have found, and through, we have thousands and thousands, we reach 1 million people every month through our social media platforms. The thing that I have learned more than any other lesson in talking about loss across the long arc with so many people is that it is very hard to feel like you're healing or be able to build something again or make a big change without a sense of acknowledgement in what you are going through at this moment. It is very hard to feel like you are healing without feeling acknowledged that your personal lot looks really freaking hard and looks like really sucky, right? And I feel like we don't do a good enough job of creating spaces to examine our own losses, even if they're not from death loss. We have so many losses that we are all dealing with. If we don't make the space to examine those just on our own, but especially in community, then it's really hard for us to be empathic toward each other. I think we're harder on each other. I think we forget that everybody is going through something. You have no idea what someone else is, the person who's like throwing a fit because the oat milk ran out at the Starbucks, you never know. Like, they might have just had a miscarriage. You have no, or they could just be a jerk, But like, it could be both. A lot of jerks have miscarriages too, So it's true. But so, I think that it's just so important to intentionally create space to explore these topics that can sound really scary and really overwhelming, and you want to push them away. But we all know that the more you try and push this away, the more it digs its talons into you. It will not let go. So if you want to heal and reconnect with your world and your life and figure out who you are right now, you have to examine the hard stuff.
Okay. It's a great idea, but how do we do it? How do you create those spaces to take on those tough topics, or do it in a way that doesn't scare us, doesn't make sure that everybody's not running out of the room right now and going,
yeah. So, well, hopefully I won't send you running for the hills. I don't see a lot of hills. There's some like gentle hills out there, but hopefully you won't run for them. I think that, obviously like grief, I do it in a way that I feel personally works for me. As I said, I'm not a rabbi. I'm not a psychologist. I'm just like a person in the world who had a hand dealt to them and realized how lonely it felt, how it felt so weird to go on a date with someone and like try and figure out what you're supposed to say when they ask you where your parents live. And, where are your parents? And I got very good at saying like, just this like middle tense of like, they're in Philadelphia. Like, I didn't say they're buried in Philadelphia. I mean, because it just took me so long to figure out, how do I dip my toe in the water of opening up without shame? Because the thing that I did most to myself was feel like something was wrong with me because something happened to me that I didn't even choose. And I'm a joyful person. I mean, I love laughing. I love life. I love absorbing new experiences. I love people. But this stuff is hard. When you go through a profound loss, it seeps out of you. You need to be invited to engage with it and not just, say in synagogue or at your once-a-week therapist, office. So what I try and do is provide fora for people to engage with it, say online, in online groups, I do live events in New York. I do comedy nights, stand-up nights that are grief comedy. Yeah, it sounds so weird, but it's awesome. I provide a lot of counterintuitive ways for people to engage with this topic because, as I said, working for Stephen really taught me that the best way to educate people about something that sounds really scary is to prove to them that it's not. That, like, the worst has already happened, right? Like, your person died, you lost your job, right? Your house burned down. Now you have to figure out, what meaning are you gonna tease from the rubble, right? How are you gonna create meaning from this? Not like forget it and pretend everything is fine, but how do you fold your losses into your life? And how do you do it while being able to talk to other people about it and ask them to share theirs? So, this is a perfect example of like, how do you create experiences? Well, here we are,
In your book, you talk about the 10 people from hell, right? And I'm really struck by what you just said about creating lots of forum for people to talk. But how do you move away from those people and that sense of competitive grief?
Yeah. So what she's talking about is there's a section in my book. So the book, which I wrote in the darkest depths of the pandemic, and I'm from New York. I mean, it was intense in New York City during COVID. I wrote this book alone in a room over the course of like the election, if you remember when Trump lost, of January 6th. Like, it was an intense time to be writing a book on grief. And so there's this section called The 10 People You Meet in Hell. And it's really meant to, if I say so myself, it's kind of humorous, but it's anchored in truth, right? When we are grieving, when we are really having a hard time, there are types of people or statements that are made to us that 10 out of 10 times, I don't believe ever really help, right? And so I talk about those. I mean, they're the platitudes, right? They're in a better places. You can always have another baby. At least you have another healthy child. At least your mom met your husband. I mean, all these things, the at leasts, the you can always, the assurances. It takes a year, It doesn't. It takes forever, And so we promote these ideas, or the toxic positivity police, right? Which a lot of people they feel so uncomfortable around, uncomfortable topics that they just want to insist, like, look on the bright side. There's so many things to be grateful for. I mean, yes, I'm highly aware that there are things in my life to be grateful for. Not everything is on fire. But the more you insist that I should focus on that, the less you're more invisible you're making me feel here in what I'm really going through, and the more resentful I am becoming towards you. And by extension, it doesn't make me I'm not nurturing myself to the point where I can be there for other people, So I think that a lot of this is about really absorbing the reality that the onus is, in the end, on the person going through the hard time to figure out what they need and how do they get it. And that's not a nice thing to hear, right? It's not fair. I think the world deserves to serve us, everything on satin pillows when, let's say our mom dies, our partner dies, or we have a stillbirth, or any type of horrible loss, right? But that's just not the way it works. I mean, everyone still has their own problems, their own realities, their own overwhelm. And so we need to figure out, is one of our friends saying something that is just hitting the wrong way every single time, to the point where we just want to slug them? We need to get to the point where we say, listen, I know that you care about me. This is not helping. Do you know what would help? This. We need to figure out, how do we stand up for ourselves at work? How do we draw boundaries between us and others who aren't making us feel too good? It is just the tough love reality of loss. And I'm trying to convince people that, the word empower yourself, or that term, is a silly term. We all have agency. We just need to be reminded that we can use it even in our darkest moments.
And that's the handbook, right? Effectively, in a nutshell. Tell us a little bit, for those of you who haven't yet read it.
So the handbook is, honestly, it's what I really wish that someone would have given me after my parents died, because I was like, where's the book? Where's the road? Tell me what to do, because I don't know what the heck is going on. I felt, after my mom died, and my mom was my person, I have so many people in the world who I love so much, and my mom was my person. There was no one who compared to her. She saw straight through me, in the best ways and in the most real ways, and to lose her, let's put it this way, to describe how great she was, there were 3 ex-boyfriends of mine at her funeral, and they were not there for me. They loved her. So she was the glue of society. She held everyone together. She held my family together. She had Pesach. She had Rosh Hashanah. Without her, the nucleus of my life was just gone, and I felt very untethered from where I came from. I didn't understand what I was standing on anymore. And I didn't understand because there was no guidebook, and because I was living in a time where people were saying it takes a year, oh, it's okay, you had 30 great years with her, and I was like, why is that not making me feel better? I was hoping to have 30 more, she was very healthy. She died in an accident. And so I realized that what I was really missing was for somebody to help me figure out ways to stay connected to her memory, which is so important, right? I think that we are encouraged to maybe kind of push stuff away, it's been a year, it's time to move on. It's time to start dating again. It's time. When is it time? Only you can decide when it's time, right? But you do need to figure out how to stay connected in a way that feels very real to you, to the memory of your person, of your pet, of the hard thing that you are grieving, right? Through ritual, and we'll talk about that later, through memory, and I will even argue through asking yourself questions that might not always be the nicest questions that you want to consider, like asking questions about unresolved things with that person, because we are all fallible humans, right? And no relationship ends with one person dying and everything being said perfectly between the two. That's just like not the way that it works. We're all human. There is no such thing as closure. And so we are alone, are left to contend with what was left unsaid, unhealed, unresolved. So I ask a lot of questions in here that are uncomfortable, but that might bring up things that you want to take to a therapist because, this stuff, the trauma, it will stay in you until you acknowledge it, and it will get louder and louder and louder. I also write the whole section about how do you stay connected to the world around you, right? You still have to be a person in the world. You still probably want to contribute to this vibrant community that you're a part of, right? How do you stay connected to your workplace? How do you have a career? I was 30. I still had to pay my rent. I had to get promoted at work. I couldn't afford to get fired. I still had to date. It was a lot. How do you do all of that? How do you stay connected to the world when you feel like your world doesn't make sense anymore? And finally, how do you stay connected to yourself, right? How do you treat your body kindly? How do you deal with things like anxiety, sleep? How do you channel your hard things into kind of creative and artistic projects that might become very powerful tools in your toolbox of building resilience? Because it's all meant for not just this year of grieving, it's meant for evermore. I was my own guinea pig. I did the exercises in my book after I wrote it, and my mom had died 15 years beforehand. They were still germane.
And you wrote it in the middle of a pandemic.
Yep.
So you wrote it in the midst of loss, in quite an isolating time. That must have been added to, or at least made it more difficult, or...
Yeah, I think in some ways it made it harder because I saw no human people for a year. And if you can't tell, I'm a real extrovert. I mean, I'm one of those weird people who I'm a writer, but then I can't just write. I'll go insane. I need my people, and I love giving talks and I love meeting communities and helping build communities. And that's why I went into TV and became a producer as opposed to just writing bylines, because that's, to me, too lonely. But this book, in some ways, writing it over the winter of 2020, 2021, which was really, I was in a house in Western Massachusetts, and probably in England, it gets dark at 2 o'clock in the winter in Massachusetts. So I was basically shrouded in darkness in my guest room. To just reveal a bit of the setting, my husband, who was an incredibly healthy 40-year-old runner, was the first person I ever knew to get COVID in March 2020. And to this day, he still has long COVID. He could not run for 19 months. My son was in the hospital with COVID briefly. He had just turned 6 before the pandemic. So I was simultaneously writing a book about grief and wondering if I was going to be soon grieving again. And so in some ways, that made it even more excruciating. In other ways, it was so freeing, because I won't use any bad words on the stage, but I gave 0 Fs. I had 0 Fs left to give, because I was there was no vaccine, Trump was still president, sorry, but I don't like him, I'll just say that. We're allowed to say, he's an awful person. Okay, I'm sorry, literally, thank you. I mean, I was breaking out into hives with the election with Biden, and then there was January 6th, and I was how is the world still turning? Okay, I'm gonna say what I have to say. And so I feel because of the setting in which I was writing, because of my family circumstances, because I felt so isolated, and I didn't know if this might be the final product I ever was going to produce. That sounds dramatic, but remember those days? They were scary. Yeah. And I went back to the micro stages of early loss. I had to go back to, what did I do to get through the days after my mom died? When those days of COVID, you didn't understand what they looked like. Remember those first days when every day felt like a year? Yeah. It's hard to remember, but that's what it felt like. And so I was I don't know, maybe we're all gonna die, so I'm just gonna write what I have to say. And so I think in many ways, it's the best writing I've ever done, not because it's it deserves a Pulitzer. I don't know, just maybe it does, but I don't think so. But I think it's just because I was very true to myself. And when you're a writer, that is the most that you can hope for. But you read through it and you're this is me, this sounds like me. And I'm very proud of that.
I mean, you should be. It's an incredible book. Let's talk about the book inside it a little bit. And one of the metaphors that you use, and I really love it, is the metaphor of the crab. As a way of moving, because also it's a really visual. You should tell it. It's better.
No, thanks. And I'm glad you brought that up. So there's one section, and I of the book, and I added it the day before I had a year to write a book, and then I waited for 7 months. Anyone who writes knows what I'm talking about. I like, just la la la, I'm just going to freak out about the fact that I have to write a book for 7 months, and then I'm going to realize I have to write a book, and then I'll write it in a few months. And then I was about to hand in my manuscript, and I was like, something is missing here. What is missing? And then I realized what was missing, and I wrote it after going on a hike. That was my sanity during COVID. I couldn't go to the gym. I couldn't do anything. Couldn't go to a wedding. Couldn't go to a few. I went to Zoom funerals. I went to Zoom weddings. I could hike. I was in great shape during that time. And during my hike, I would think, and I would write in my head. And I came home and wrote this section, and it's a framing piece for how to regard this book before you dive into it. And also, I think it's how people... My hope is I hope people will kind of regard moving through hard things in general. Because loss, yes, we're talking, modern loss was born from my experience with loss to death, right? But the truth is that you pull the thread, this pertains to every type of loss. We all have our losses. We all have layers of loss from the last few years. Loss of identity, maybe the addition of roles that we didn't think we'd have and we're juggling so much at once. Loss of coping mechanisms, loss of being able to go to the pub and have a drink in person, celebrate, hug people. Loss of that feeling that you're not going to get sick if you touch somebody. I mean, there was just so much that we've been through, and I think that we're so insistent on moving forward that a lot of us haven't stopped ourselves to consider, wait, what have I been through, and how does that feel, And so I talk about how this thing that I mentioned earlier about how, we love using war metaphors or strength metaphors when it comes to hard things, right? You'll fight the battle, you'll power through it, and it's exhausting because we also talk about resilience. Even though it's part of the subtitle of my book, resilience is a buzzword. What does that even mean, right? And I think that people, when they say, oh, you're resilient, okay, but resilience doesn't always look like putting one foot in front of the other every day and doing it quickly. Sometimes resilience looks like, lying in a snotty heap on your bathroom floor for a few hours because that's what you need to do. Because if you don't, then you can't go to the next thing that you're going to do for yourself. You need releases. You need connections of joy. You need, connections of sadness. You need connections of memory. You need all of that, but only you know what you need. And so I say, instead of looking at this as going into battle at Normandy, because there's no winners or losers when it comes to this stuff, I ask people to think about crabs instead as a metaphor, which is super weird, and my editor was like, I don't know. And then she read it, she's like, okay, it's weird, but it makes sense. So, and then it became the leitmotif of the book. So I did a lot of research into crabs, and keep in mind, I had a lot of free time. I had nothing else to do, so forgive me, but I know a lot about crustaceans now. So the first thing is the horseshoe crab. Fun fact, not a crustacean, it's an actual animal. For your next cocktail party, for the closing ceremony, you can talk about that.
Next LJ quiz.
Yeah, do that. So the horseshoe crab is the most resilient animal on Earth. It has outlasted humans, been around since before humans. It's outlasted meteors, different ice ages. It is just stuck around, and it's a weird looking thing, right? And then you think of all these other crabs, right? You think of sand crabs on the beach, the ones, hermit crabs, the ones at the bottom of the ocean. And what do they have in common? Well, first, they're all crabs. These are actual crustaceans, but also they are just the wonkiest looking creatures ever. They're so freaking creepy looking. They look weird. They're inelegant, but they have this one job, which is to hang on to the bottom of the ocean, right? Hang on to whatever it is, the bottom, in the midst of all of the swirling tides and the bottom feeders that are trying to get them. Just hang on and do whatever it takes to hang on, right? And do it while looking wonky, while pivoting on the sand. Crabs are able to move forwards, backwards, they can move sideways. When something isn't working for them, they pivot. And then they do it in a different way that suits their needs in that moment. And they don't care, again, that they look weird and creepy while they're doing it. They just get it done. And that, for me, is what moving through a really hard thing looks like. It doesn't look like, freaking, I don't know, who's like a British, like really hot, like military hero. I don't know. I literally can't.
James Bond.
Oh, James, right. They
Not
don't
military, but,
if only I looked like a Bond girl after my mom died. I absolutely did not. Like in Fleabag, who's seen Fleabag? I think best grief show ever written in the UK. She talks about how she looked shockingly good at her mom's funeral, and she was like, didn't expect that. I mean, I did not look good. I looked awful, and I felt like a crap. I felt like that is what rings more true to me, which is I'm just doing my best here. And some days it's going to be putting deodorant on. And other days it's going to be standing up for myself at work and saying, I actually need to maybe, leave early 2 days a week to go to therapy or to do this thing. It's just, you're going to look wonky while you're moving through this stuff because there's no one size fits all. But you got to do it. There's no choice.
So much.
You're thinking about crabs now, aren't you?
I'm thinking about crabs, but I'm also thinking about the ritual. So the crab is getting through. Yeah. The ritual is the bit that sort of takes you from one place to another, possibly. And I'm thinking about things like when you talk about breaking shit and but also about your Judaism, because there is no question for me, as looking through the book, that your Judaism's there, and you only need to talk to you for a few minutes about, your kids and you, and your Judaism is your name, right? We had that conversation. Your Judaism is there. And I think before getting on to talking about some of those specific rituals, it would be great for us to know a little bit about whether Judaism came into your grief and into your thinking about grief, and maybe also whether it was helpful or, we were talking about, when people have, say, I wish you long life, right. About also when it can be not helpful.
Right. All good questions. Thank you. I think that, yes, I am very Jewish. I self-identify as extremely religious or adherent, but I am a New York Jewess from the Upper West Side. So I think that puts me, my kids went to Jewish preschool. I am now living inexplicably in Austin, Texas, don't ask. But I go to the JCC every day. I just did a talk for them for free a couple of weeks ago. I'm very Jewishly oriented and informed. I grew up conservative, and my parents switched over to the Reform movement. My kids go to URJ, a Reform camp in the Berkshires in Massachusetts every summer called Eisner. And for me, it is a very grounding part of who I am. It makes me feel like my feet are on something solid in a world that feels increasingly more tenuous. And I really value my Judaism and my Jewish community. And what was so moving to me as a small tangent is last night when I was outside with all of you and just watching the prayers and listening to these tunes that just, it's like, and I'm in the middle, I literally, if you showed me a map, I would get it wrong where I am right now, also because I traveled for so long. It was planes, trains, and automobiles to get here.
And Jeff.
And Jeff, and Andrew, thank you, Andrew. But I could have been anywhere, and yet I heard these songs, and I saw this joy, and I was like, I'm home, right? Even though I don't even know where I am. My husband's like, where are you again? I'm like, I'm in England. So it just was so grounding, and I'm so grateful for it. And so I do hang on to my Judaism. That said, when my mom died, I was pissed, right? And I feel like I had a right to be. She died in a terrible way. I had just seen her an hour beforehand. Thank goodness the last thing I said to her was, I love you. I don't think we all get that in sudden deaths. I just got really lucky there. And I was pissed. She died on the New Jersey Turnpike, which, if anyone knows it, is like one of the most insulting places to lose your life. And it wasn't even like a cool exit. It wasn't even like where Bruce Springsteen lives. It was like Cranberry, New Jersey. Like, it's like where outlet malls are. It was awful. There was nothing sexy about it. And I was so angry. And I remember I didn't want to have the funeral right afterward. And everyone was saying, in Philadelphia, there's like a Jewish funeral home. It's my maiden name is Rosenberg, and it's called Rosenberg, Raphael, and Sachs. And everyone goes there, Northeast Philadelphia. And they're like, okay, we need the thing, okay, we'll do it like tomorrow. And I was like, no, hold the phone. I can't even feel my body right now. Like, my dad is still in bandages. I don't think I can do this. And a lot of my family, my cousins are in California, and they were trying to come in. I'm an only child, and I was just reeling. And so they're like, well, this is tradition. And I said, I don't care. Because I need people to hold me. Like, I can't do this tomorrow. I don't even know what she's supposed to wear for all of eternity yet, because I haven't walked into, I mean, I'm still dealing with like, absorbing the fact that she's not alive. It happened so suddenly. And so that was the first thing where I kind of pushed back a little bit, right? And I talked to my parents' rabbi, and he was like, literally do whatever you need to do. Like, it's okay. And we had it like 6 days later, because I needed people to come in to hold me through this. I couldn't do it alone. I wanted to give her eulogy. I didn't think I could do that without people to crumble up into their arms afterwards. And then I remember being so angry afterwards at the Shiva, which a thing that Judaism really got right. I think it's like the rightest ritual ever created, right? And in many ways, I wish we would do a Shiva before someone dies, when they know they're going to die. I'm a big fan of like the living, I guess, lack of a better term, wake, right? Like I think, you know, it's a beautiful thing. And I think it was like, I was so numb, but I also like, I was very lucky during Shiva to connect with parts of myself that felt familiar. Because in Shiva, you're kind of, right, you're laughing, you're telling, it's like, someone said here, I can't remember who's at the cocktail party, it's like a cocktail party in hell, right? That's what it is. Because you're in hell, but people are like eating their bagels and schmear, and they're talking and their memories, right? What I did not know about Shiva is that you're not supposed to talk to the mourner unless they speak first. I did not know that rule. And no one knows that rule, apparently, because at my Shiva, everyone was talking, like, no one would shut up. They were so loud. They were like me, times 1,000, plus the ex-boyfriends. And so I learned that from my parents' rabbi at Mainline Reform Synagogue outside Philadelphia. And he said, yeah, theoretically, you're supposed to be the person. And I was like thinking about it, and I was like, that would be so great, because if that were the case, and we really respected that, then people would stop and see how the mourner is doing and really read their body language and feel their energy. Like, maybe they don't want to talk about, like, what do you need in this moment? Wait until they say what they need, what they're feeling, and then meet them at their level. And I loved that idea, but I just don't think a lot of people know about it. I certainly didn't. Shiva was very helpful for me. Another conversation that really cemented my faith in being a Jewish woman was a conversation with the rabbi telling him how angry I was, how unfair it felt, and how it felt so unfair that there were so many awful people in the world who seemed to be incredibly prolific in their bad deeds. But my mom, who was the best person in the world, had to die in this painful, awful way. And I said, you can have my Jew card. I'm out. Like, I don't believe in God. I'm like, I'm out, you know? And he said, first, I'm giving this back to you. He's like, also, that's not a thing. Like, it's like, he pantomime. He's like, there's no Jew card. But he's like, but that's okay. You can not believe, you can be angry, you can question, you can push back, you can be out for a year. You're still here. You're still part of this. Like, you're still one of us. You're still in this community, like in this people. And that for me was very helpful, because I felt like it gave me permission to kind of like, the Amish, they have this year, it's called, who knows? Yeah, you know everything about Pennsylvania? Who are you? You're like some genius? What are you, like, were you in the office too? It's amazing. Rumspringa. The Amish have this year of freedom called Rumspringa, where they send the kids out into the world to make sure that they like really want to come back and live the Amish lifestyle. And I felt like I kind of had my Rumspringa from Judaism, because even though I still went to Kaddish, because for me that was very grounding, even though I didn't really know what the words meant in Hebrew, it was a ritual and it was very grounding to me. But I felt like I had permission from this rabbi to go do my Rumspringa. I knew that I could go be angry, go question, do nothing, but still I would be welcomed back. And for me, that was so powerful. I was like, okay, I'm Jewish, like I'll stay. I mean, it wasn't like I was looking into like Episcopalianism or anything. There weren't any other options on the table for me. But one thing I will say, two last things that really I struggled with in Judaism were on Yom Kippur. Yizkor was very helpful because it was helpful to have a structure. I was so badly looking for an invitation to have a structure to like really not be okay and feel like other people were with me in memory and not being okay and remembering. But the Unetana Tokev, that part where it said who shall live and who shall die, for me, and I understand many clergy people have told me in the years, like, you're not supposed to literally take this literally. But when your mom dies in a car accident, and I'm sure everyone gets it here, think about your saddest, awful, like the hardest losses you've had in your life. What if you were examining them against the lens of like someone deciding that that person should have died? That was a real struggle for me for the first several years after my mom's death. And then the last thing that was really a struggle was the unveiling, because I felt I was given a message that the unveiling marks the end of the really hard period. And I just wonder if anybody who has had loss here has found that maybe the second year is even harder than the first, right? For me, it was when I couldn't really pretend that my mom was like in Paris every Mother's Day or birthday or Rosh Hashanah. Eventually, I had to just remember she's never going to be here for any of these things. And so that was really when the permanence of it set in. So for me, year 2, it was just a shock to me how year 2 was so much harder than year 1. And I was kind of led to believe, again, by these bite-sized pieces of wisdom that like, this marks the end of like the hardest period. And then it's like, you're moving on to like and then you're back to life. Well, I felt like I was dying the second year. And so that's why I say like, I think that every religion, every, type of thought, every type of community can examine how to better convey messaging, especially through a contemporary lens,
And you do, very much in the book, invent new rituals or give permission for people to invent their own rituals. I was thinking about some of the stuff around anniversaries, those moments in the year that are particularly difficult, or the breaking of plates, for example, as well, of the ritual being important, but that there's permission to do those rituals differently.
Yes. So I'm a cultural omnivore. I mean, if I see something from any culture and it feels like, oh, that seems like that would be nice to do, I'll do it. Like, I don't care, And so there's a whole section in the book about ritual, because modern loss, it's very Jewishly informed. I talk about my Judaism all the time. As I just told a couple of people, I've done 2 national Jewish book council tours in the United States. I've spoken at many synagogues, many JCCs. But it's not a religious book. It's not a Jewish book, right? It's for everybody, because I wanted to create a forum by starting Modern Loss where everybody could feel comfortable, regardless of who you are, what you believe, anything, whether you believe in nothing, whether you believe in everything, I don't care. For me, I created this as a storyteller and a community builder, right, and a journalist and a writer, right, and somebody who's like not only president of whatever they're doing, but also a member too. And so through ritual, I have learned many things. Like, for example, there's really no ritual in Western culture for miscarriage and abortion. There are a lot of people who have to terminate pregnancies that are wanted pregnancies. They still, they have abortions because something is terribly wrong. Maybe their health is in danger, or maybe their baby's health is in danger, and there aren't a lot of there are no rituals in Western culture for that. And I found one in Buddhist culture, which is beautiful, and it really came out of World War II. The birth control pill was not legal in Japan until like sometime in the 90s. And so because of that, there were so many abortions there because there was just no Yeah, there was no other alternative. And it wasn't that that women were going out saying, you know what I'd love to do, have 10 abortions in my lifetime. No, they were very sad for these women. They were like, we'd probably rather just take a pill. And so they created this Buddhist ritual. It stems from Buddhism. And it's a beautiful ritual, which I have now promoted through Modern Loss. And we've actually done these at cemeteries in Brooklyn during Infant and Pregnancy Loss Awareness Month, which is in October. We've given bereaved parents ways to use their bodies and use their minds and create a space to honor the losses that they've had through stillbirth, through miscarriage, through infant loss. I mean, these are awful things that we make taboos on top of taboos, right? So talking about grief is already a taboo. You know, talking about stillbirth, no one wants to talk about that stuff. And yet, 1 in 4 women will experience a pregnancy-related loss. In terms of other creative rituals, you know, I am a big fan of ritual because much like in Judaism, when you find yourself like swaying your body or, you know, saying words that still feel kind of foreign, you know, in Hebrew, maybe you can't exactly translate them. It's ritualistic, right? Because it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's intentional, right? It's a part of a ceremony. Maybe it's once a year. Maybe it's every day. Maybe, who knows, right? But it's ephemeral. And it ends. And the most important part also is that your body is involved in it. That is a very important part of ritual that I've learned. And so I offer many ideas for like, how do you create a ritual that honors your losses, connects you with your person, your memories, in ways that are maybe outside of like the rote and the what is expected of you to do? Because maybe you want to do something that has something to do with what the person believed in, or activities you did together, or something they never got to do, you know? Maybe they're around Hanukkah or Rosh Hashanah, you're feeling their absence so much that you want to create a ritual outside of that or around the holiday that involves them. And so I find that anything that is like really tactical, that involves body work, is very, it like just makes you feel like your entire being is present in it. And then you feel like here we're creating an hour of space, even if it's 3 minutes of space, you feel like you've intentionally acknowledged your loss and you can move on with your day. And that is I'm telling you, it's incredibly powerful. And I drank the Kool-Aid. I do this stuff myself all the time.
Thank you. I want to give a chance for some questions, but you've got something that we're going to do people can think about while they are thinking of their question.
Okay, so is this the end? Can I say one coda to all of this?
Of course you can.
You know, I just want to say, first of all, again, I'm just so honored to be here, and I know that everybody here has so many different types of loss. Obviously, I don't know you all, and I don't know exactly what you're dealing with, but some of us have losses that are so traumatizing that it's hard for us to even get to the point where we want to touch them on the surface level. And I just really encourage you to try to, because it is the way you know, I think when you go through something really hard, sometimes you have to make a choice as to whether you're going to stick around. And I'm not saying that everybody gets to a point where they're going to take their lives, but like you feel sometimes like you're losing yourself. And you know what I mean? And who am I now? Am I lost? Am I in there? And you have to make a choice. No, I'm going to be here. But then if you made that choice, you kind of owe it to yourself. You know, people say they would want you to be happy. Okay, awesome. They'd want you to be happy. Guess what? They're not around anymore. God bless them. Let's remember them. We miss them every day deeply. Do it for yourself. You'd want you to be happy. You deserve it. You deserve to figure out how to speak up for yourself, how to form community, how to find your friends, the people to talk to. And many of them probably you don't even know yet. I promise you that they're out there. But it takes effort, but I promise. I mean, I never thought I would get to the point where I could just be like a generally neurotic person again. Like I spent many years just being so existential. Like I was like, are we all gonna die? Like we're all gonna die. Like I would like walk down the street, I'd see a person, I'm like, you're a pre-dead person. Like everything felt very like existential to me in the first years after my parents' death. I never thought that I could freak out over the fact that like I was like almost out of like, you know, like a certain brand of pancake mix for my kids and when they have it at the store. And the first time that I did that, I was like, I'm back. Because I was so grateful in a weird way that I could be my like dumb neurotic self again. I never thought I would.
Also to not be yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like also to be somebody different in because of being shaped by
Yeah,
loss.
and I argue that, like, you know, you are still you, and you find different parts of yourself, like they arise. But anyone who says you're not you anymore, you're still there, I promise you. Just new facets of yourself are going to come out. And when I say resilience, a lot of the times resilience can be, you know, considered in terms of what we've already been through. So if you ever need a reminder, can I get through something hard? Think of like the hardest thing you've already been through and how you're still here. You know, you can do hard things. That doesn't mean that it's without pain, you know, not without pain or hardship or sadness or ugly tears, but you can do these hard things, but you need to stand up for yourself and build a toolbox so that you can take care of yourself in a world that has so many people with their own problems as well. And the last thing I want to say is don't forget about joy, right? I think a lot of people, you know, we're supposed to be somber. We're supposed to say, I wish you a long life. Maybe instead, just a couple tips, you know, instead of saying, I wish you a long life, people just want, again, acknowledgement. They don't want your assurances. They don't want you to say to look on the bright side in any platitudinal way. They don't want, you know, they don't want you to tell, you know, they don't want you to tell them a fact that they already know, that maybe biologically they can get pregnant again. Like, they're not idiots. They know this, right? They know that that person would have wanted them to be happy. Just take a minute. Look at what their body looks like. What does it look like, their state they're in right now? What do you think they need, you know? And if you're at a loss for words, what always works is, I wish I had the perfect thing to say. I wish I did. And I don't, but because I'm kind of new at this too. But I really care about you, and I'm here to listen. And just make it clear that, like, you're willing to sit with them in whatever muck in which they're sitting, and that it's not going to scare you off. Because hard things are not contagious, but we act like they are. And the more that we act like they're just hard things to talk about, the better we're going to get at, like, becoming a better society. So there you go.
Thank you.
So now, okay, so before we go to questions, if you can't tell, I'm a bit of a strict task mistress, and I did come with some homework for you, because I always say that people are looking for an invitation to engage with this stuff. So, of course, you and I have been talking, but, like, you don't want to hear from me the whole time. I want to hear from you, because this is a community. It's a beautiful community, and also you just received this huge announcement. There are going to be a lot of exciting changes, but also there will be things left behind as well. I mean, there will be changes. Change is hard. Change is hard. It's hard for me to tell my kid that it's time to, like, get off the iPad and get into the car. So I know change is hard, right? But COVID started in March 2020, and it's still going, even though some of the world pretends it's not. There are a lot of people who live with long COVID. There are a lot of people who get affected when they get sick. And the world has changed forever. And I feel, like I said, a lot of us have so many different types of loss. Maybe we've had deaths in the last few years. Maybe we couldn't go to funerals. Maybe, you know, we've lost touch with people. Who knows, right? But so I would love to do an exercise that's called a 6-word memoir with everybody here. And I do this a lot. I do talks at corporations, and I do a lot at JCCs. And this gives everybody a chance to share a sliver of your experience with loss. And when I say loss, anything. If it feels like loss to you, it's loss. So, like, whatever, right? The umbrella definition of loss. And I would like you to think about what is a 6-word memoir that would describe 6 words on your loss, right? I'll give you an example. This stems from a Hemingway short story, which is For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. Anyone know this one? Right? Very, very literate audience. Jews, you know, we read. So what does that do when you read that, right? What are your reactions? You're like, okay, first of all, you're like, what happened to this baby? Like, is she okay? Like, did she die? Or, like, did she just grow really, does she have, like, weirdly large feet, like, and they never fit her? It could be anything. It could be, like, the worst possible thing, or something, like, just totally that's not a big deal. But it's enough that it creates intrigue. It makes you want to learn more about the story. And then the person telling the story is just sharing 6 words, so they don't feel like they're being asked to just spill their guts everywhere. it's just dipping their toe in the water of what it feels like to share a little bit about what you're going through. And it's meant to crack open a community. And so I would like everybody here, we're going to do Q&As, but during the Q&As, because I'm coming back to you, I want everybody to think about what are your 6 words on loss. You should have papers and pencils. If not, raise your hand and they'll be passing them out. And afterwards, I would like people to stand up and share.
If they want.
If they want, yes, I'm not going to call on you, but I will give a couple examples to get you thinking of ones that have come up in our events. One is she never got to see Paris. Another is never met you but love you. Another is 6 years on, still really sucks. One is, I think it was never got to say goodbye. Who am I going to be now? And then I'll give a couple of mine. I would say, given the setting, your grandkids are Jewish, you're welcome. Because my parents never got to meet my kids, you know, and that never doesn't suck, you know. So I would love for you to think of yours. They can be funny, they can be sad, they can be 6 words that have nothing to do with each other, they can be phrases.
Thank you. But should we take some questions while people are doing? Becca has the roving mic, and I can see our first there, and Paul.
Hello. How do you deal with disagreement in a grieving community?
How do you deal with disagreement in a grieving community?
Yeah.
Can you give a little more context? Not like, but like, you mean like different personalities grieving in different ways?
Yeah, like people commenting on how other people are grieving and what they're saying and a bit of friction.
It's a tough thing. Yeah. I think that's a great question because it's something that pops up all the time, right? So we call it, as in me, like the royal I. I call it, sorry, I'm in England, so I call it the Grief Olympics, and it's like a losing battle every single time, right? Grief is grief is grief. And I think that we get to a point where we judge people for how they're grieving, even within families. We grieve differently because we all have different personalities. We all had a different dynamic with the person who died. It's all different. It's very individualized, right? But we don't have to make it isolating. We make it isolating when we draw lines and we're like, you're grieving the wrong way. I'm grieving in a better way. This is acceptable. That's not acceptable. It's all acceptable. I say, as long as you're not hurting yourself or anybody else, you need to do whatever feels right to you. I think that we get into these competitions of like, I don't know why they're having such a hard time. Their dad died and he was 90. My baby died, you know, that's like goes against nature. Or I shouldn't be having such a hard time. My sister died, but like I don't know, like their child was murdered. I'm just coming up with an example. The thing is that like all we have is our own perspective, our own daily lives. And there's enough room in the world to hold everybody's painful story. Like there's nothing but room in this world. There's room for us to listen to everybody and what they're going through, and then to share our experience. And so when we do get into a judgmental phase, I think it's really hard because no one wins. And I think it's just us trying to make sense of something that doesn't make any sense, which is grief. It's like a monster. It's very much a dynamic thing because we're alive. And so I do encourage people in communities where there is so much discord to just take a minute and share. And I really do think that the sharing, like this 6-word memoir, I really do think that giving people the same thing to do and talk about and share how they're feeling differently is very helpful because you're doing it within the structure of the same conversation, exercise, you know, but everyone's gonna have a different answer. And I think if you just encourage people to listen to the other person for a minute, you know, instead of just judge, that can go a long way. I mean, it's really hard. I mean, grief is like, it brings out just our rawness, like our ids, you know, and we're just like we're an exposed nerve and we can be extra sensitized, but I do, you know, so there's no like real fix, there's no vaccine for grief, you know, but there is understanding and we can do a much better job of realizing that everybody is in pain, even if they're not expressing it in ways that seem that we would express it.
Cool.
somehow it's always too soon. That's my 6th word. But my question is, well, firstly, thank you. That was wonderful. That was very real and very genuine. It's very moving. But I wondered, after your mother died, how was your relationship with your father?
That's a really good question. It's almost as though I planted you in the audience. That's a very good question. And I will be candid with you because I think that it might help other people. My dad and I were extremely close. My mom and my dad, we were a trio. You know, I was their only child between the two of them. They were deeply in love with each other, and we were just like a little trio. And when my mom died, but my dad was like this, it's like my mom gave birth to my dad in many ways. So like, I'm the, you know, it's like I in the good side, I feel like I shared his wit. I shared his, you know, humor. I also shared his stubbornness and, you know, pig-headedness and, you know, need to like be heard. And so he and I would butt heads a lot more because we were both kind of similar. When my mom, I realized really deeply only after she died that she was kind of the buffer between us. And having that dynamic disappear, I realized that that is like a collateral damage part of grief. There are so many secondary losses that come. You don't just lose a person, you lose a dynamic. All of the dynamics that had to do with that person are shifted and rejiggered. I had to learn how to deal with my dad and talk to him and be with him in a completely different way. It was like having to learn another language. It was like I didn't know him all of a sudden. It was so weird and uncomfortable and sad. And it took us a lot of work, you know? It was hard because he mostly wanted me to support him emotionally. He was also from a different generation where he didn't like just spew on about grief at Jewish conferences. He just sat with it, and then he'd like write me emails at 3 a.m. about how he was feeling, and I would wake up to them and carry them all day while working at a comedy show. So it was very, very difficult for me because I was like, where's my parent? I need a parent. Like, I need someone to hold me right now. So it was really hard, and it took a lot of work. We had to talk a lot. So it was rough, you know, and eventually, like, you know, we managed to figure it out, thank goodness, you know, and then he died. So, you know, but we figured it out. But I will say, like, it just highlights something that I did want to say, like, just be aware that when you lose somebody, or a person loses someone, they're not just losing that person, they're losing all the future memories they were hoping to have, you know? They're losing a sense of control. They're losing so many other things, you know? And I think that that's very important to realize.
Thank you.
It's not just like funeral, Shiva, done.
Yeah, done. That's it. Debbie.
Hi, thank you for addressing the issue of saying, have a long life, I wish you long life. I hate that so much. When my husband died, I did not want to live a long life without him, and I found it really difficult. People keep saying this, and I never say it to anyone. I really appreciate the fact that you've addressed this.
Thank you for saying that. And, you know, again, in the States, we don't, and Charlie was the one who told me that here you say, I wish you a long life. And I wanted to like, I wanted to like jump into the ground with my mom. Long life, that literally sounds like the worst possible thing to me, right? At that moment. And what I say is like, it's not that, you know, I always tell people, because I've learned this, all I know is my own experience with grief, but now I know the experience of so many other people in modern loss. They have taught me exponentially more than I would have ever learned on my own. And I always say, like, there's so much room for creativity and improvisation in grief. I will die on the hill, though, that says that the platitudes ever help, because they don't. So maybe in here it's, I wish you a long life, and maybe in the States it's like, oh, they're in a better place. And it's like, even the person with the most faith that I ever met has told me, you know, it didn't really help to hear that, because you're just, you know, how does that help? And again, there are so many easy alternatives that we can offer. I think that we take it upon ourselves to fix someone's grief, to be the answer to their pain. And guess what? You're not the answer to their pain. There's nothing you can do, right? The only thing you can do to help is to be there with them and to not erase it. And don't try and erase it. Don't not mention it. I always say the worst thing you could say is nothing, because it makes the other person feel like they're going insane, wondering if anybody remembers.
Thank you. Shall we take some of our
Sure.
six-word stories?
And if you could, if anybody wants to share, that would be really great. And I just ask if you could stand up and try and speak as obnoxiously loudly as I speak.
We've got one at the back.
Yeah. Or is there a mic to pass around?
there's a mic.
I was wondering if you could give a few tips for the family doctor. What do you want to hear from us?
So the question is, are there any tips for the family doctor? Something that you could give advice on?
For the family doctor, you mean in terms of like empathy?
Things to say. What would you like?
Yeah, I think that's a good question too. I mean, there's so many practitioners now who are working with medical professionals and medical students in like empathic training, because I do think that bedside manner, especially in the United States where it's like a business, like the medical field is a business. We have to pay for our healthcare there. We don't get a lot of bedside manner. We don't have doctors who have the luxury of sitting with us and giving us time. We have doctors who are like really on the clock and have to fit a lot of patients in. And so what slips away, I think, is that space, that breathing room to sit with patients and sit with survivors of patients and really be empathic. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say to medical professionals, like, please remember that your patients are not patients. They're human people with stories, with names, with families, with memories, with hopes. And to remember that before you have any conversation. I think that has really suffered in the last many years in my country.
And here. Judy. The mic, just take the mic.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was really interested, and I wish someone had told me almost, how difficult it is when you get to what you beautifully call the unveiling and we call stone setting, and I much prefer unveiling, which we set my husband's stone a couple of weeks ago, actually, and the lead up to that, nothing prepared me for that. I think I was so anaesthetised by the horror and the suddenness of his death that I knew we knew what we had to do, the children and I, and then there's this uncharted territory, all bound comes back on you, and now we are going towards the second year, and I was interested to hear what you're saying, so I'm really looking forward to reading your book, because I think I need to. But that was like this horrible reality of looking at a tombstone, trying to decide what to put on it, and knowing they're under it. It's just, so I think it's nice to be warned.
I'm so sorry
Thank
that
you.
you've been through this. It's very hard. It's very hard seeing a name set in stone, or in bronze, literally. It really makes it quite permanent.
So much news. Where are you?
So much news. Where are you? Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd be willing to share theirs?
You'd be so proud of her.
You'd be so proud of her.
Hugs hurt slightly more with stubble. Oh. Hugs hurt slightly more with stubble.
Hope.
Hugs hurt slightly more with stubble.
Oh.
I've got a better one than
Thank
that,
you.
though. This is one I thought up after going to I went to a wonderful Catholic funeral and wake up in Aylesbury a few years ago. It was my friend's partner's father, who was well up in the Sri Lankan Catholic Church, and I thought he was going up there with the saints. And one of the priests said to me, while he was drinking a couple of bottles of Argentinian red with his curry, well, now we can open a new bottle of malt whiskey.
Thank you, Michael.
Mine is still telling stories about you.
Oh, thank you. So important.
I've just got a couple which don't relate to death exactly. The first one is, after your stroke, talking isn't great. And the other one is, you retired, but your profession crashed.
Yeah, that's what, any loss, you know. Thank you. Last round, anyone? This side of the room, come on, come through.
Wish you could see us all.
Wish you could see us all. Yes, over there. And while you're passing, I'm just saying, like, doesn't it feel so good just for 6 words to feel like you are asking people to bear witness to your story, even just for 4 seconds? You know, just think about how that feels and maybe how you could have more of that.
Sorry, I didn't get it down to 6, it's 7.
We'll hyphenate one.
Yeah.
It's England. You hyphenate everything here.
Okay. Struggling, building differently, a better life.
Struggling, building differently, a better life.
And then keeping me fit.
You stayed you right to the end.
You stayed you right till the end. Oh, thank you.
Rebecca, we got
last one. You're the closer.
She never met my boys.
She never met my boys. That could be mine too. Thank you.
Rebecca, I want to thank you so much for taking us to this place, for ensuring that we created space for this in all sorts of ways. It's a really important moment for us. And for being with us, which has also been such a gift. And I think it's a gift that actually we're going to continue to find ways to share, and certainly to try and avoid saying, I wish you a long life, and to look for
How
different
about instead,
words.
I wish you a meaningful life.
A meaningful life.
Right? I'm an editor. Not to brag. I have a way with words.
Rebecca is going to be in the lobby signing her book. I know that I won't be alone in taking this home with me. So thank you on behalf of all of us. Let's say a big thank you.
Thanks, everyone.